All right, Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown podcast. A little bit of a special edition here, Ryan. I'm Brian Driscoll, the publisher at irishbreakdown.com. That is Ryan Roberts, our director of recruiting. And as the title down there shows, we actually have it correct this time. It is our recruiting hour. And so, Ryan, we're going to talk. We have some topics that we want to discuss that will kind of be the hour. And then when we're done with those topics, whether it be a little before an hour, at an hour, a little over, then we'll go into some questions. So going to be recruiting focused today. As always, if you want to ask some team questions, you can. We will answer those at the end, but we're going to stick to the topic. And we are going to stay with recruiting, even though there's some NIL stuff that broke. We're going to talk about that stuff tomorrow. Today, we're going to talk about recruiting. And before we kind of dive into this selected topic, Ryan, I do think it's we should probably discuss sort of that there will be some news this weekend, one way or the other, when we look at recruiting. That is on Friday at 4 p.m. Sullivan Absher, 2023 offensive lineman from, I always want to say Reagan, but that's Pendleton, right? Mm-hmm. Belmont, North Carolina. Sullivan Absher is going to be deciding between Notre Dame, Clemson, and NC State. We will be live at 4 o'clock to discuss his decision, what it means for Notre Dame one way or the other, and kind of talk about what's next for Notre Dame one way or the other. So, Ryan, I think before we kind of dive into the topic, I do want to spend a couple minutes here on the Sullivan Absher situation because, I think this is going to be the first recruitment that shows if Harry Hiestand can kind of get a guy that's not already kind of predestined to Notre Dame. And you said this from like the first time you talked to Sam Pendleton after he got his offer. I remember you texting me like, yeah, that kid loves Notre Dame. I mean, it was so obvious right away that Sam Pendleton was very aware of Coach Hiestand's background and what he could do and the academic piece. And as you get to know his family just a little bit, you're like, yeah, I can see why a kid like that would like Notre Dame like he does. So that was going to be one that, let's be honest, most Notre Dame coaches probably could have got that one done if they would have offered Sam Pendleton and gone after him. Sullivan Absher is a little different situation, Ryan, because even though Notre Dame had him on campus in January and Coach Hiestand went down and met him after he was hired and, during that winter sort of on the road period for the staff, Clemson, pretty close. I mean, Clemson is pretty close. This is the thing. Clemson is – we talked about this. Clemson, Belmont, North Carolina is actually closer to Clemson in distance than where Monroe Freeling is to Clemson, who's actually from South Carolina, right, when you look at where they are. So he's only 2 hours away from Clemson. Clemson was considered the team to beat, and this was going to be this will be the first opportunity for us to see, okay, can Harry Hiestand get on the trail along with Tommy Reese and Chad Bowden and go get a kid that maybe wasn't sort of a typical, of course you're going to get that kid type of prospect.
Yeah, no, it's going to be really interesting to watch because, I mean, for every reason that you just kind of, that you kind of named there, Pendleton is a kid who, from the first time I spoke to him, said that he wanted to hear from Notre Dame, right? So there was an obvious interest from Notre Dame just to begin with. And then you add in the fact that Coach Hiestand was the one that identified him, right? He saw him and that's my guy, right? And then it starts from square one at that point. But when you don't start from square one with a guy like a Sullivan Absher, it's a different conversation because they were recruiting this kid since Jeff Quinn was the offensive line coach, obviously. So that in just general, and we know this, that kills momentum a little bit, right? Even if you're in a good spot with a guy, when there's a coaching change, the momentum stalls. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that it dies, but it does stall for a second. So then you have to get refamiliarized with the young man. Coach Hiestand has to, do his due diligence, make sure first and foremost, and identify that, yes, that kid is a kid I want in my offensive line room to start out with.
And that's also something that the kids have to be concerned. Like you talk about breaking the momentum, Ryan. It's not just for Hiestand, but if you're Sullivan Absher and Monroe Freeling and Charles Jagasol and all these kids, Jagusa and all these kids, it's okay. Is Coach Hiestand going to want me? And that's going to create some doubt. And in that window, and it was like a month between when one guy was hired and fired and the other guy was hired. I believe it was about a month. There's sort of a lot of in your head kind of building up like, okay, is this new coach going to want me or not, or whatever the case may be. So back to what you were saying though, Ryan, but it's not just on Notre Dame's end that creates some of that decision-making process.
Yeah, and it obviously Coach Easton did identify him and said, yes, I obviously want him in the class, and he became a priority. But even before Coach Easton was there, I didn't feel overly great about that recruitment. I wasn't. I've been very candid about this. Is the fact that I didn't love where they were with Sullivan Absher. I always thought they were running a distant second, not not that they weren't in it at all, but I thought Clemson had separated themselves, to be honest with you. And then obviously he gets back on campus for the blue gold game, and that completely changes. It's a combination of alumni on campus, the vibe, the atmosphere around Notre Dame, the relationships that he's building with the coaches and the players and the other recruits that are on campus. And now you go into this week, Brian, on Friday, of course, and you feel pretty good about this one, man. Like, obviously, we have kind of done a complete 180 as far as how we feel this recruitment is kind of lending. And Notre Dame is the favorite going into that one, right? And we've been talking that it's been an odd year for a Clemson Notre Dame battle for these offensive linemen from the Carolinas. And
you're going to have an article coming up on that this week as well. I got to edit and stuff, but yeah, it's an interesting look at it. It really is.
It's not a typical one at all. And I mean, Notre Dame is I know Clemson technically didn't make Sam Pendleton's top four. That was like his finalist.
It's because that was a strategic move. Let's be honest about that. Schools are good about that. Notre Dame's previous staff made a killing. I don't know if Brian Polian never lost a recruit at Notre Dame. Never. They always dropped a kid before he was ready to make a decision. Right. That's just how it goes. So there's strategery in that, Ryan, where they're right on the kid and all of a sudden they back out, even though that's a big need for them. No, they knew what we knew, that he was going to go Notre Dame. And so you bow out in hopes of then saving face with, and it's a smart strategy, if we're being honest, because now it's like you can go to Absher and Monroe Freeling and some of these other guys, say, hey, look, we backed out of that one. We were going to let Notre Dame have that one because you're our guy.
Right.
And it's smart. It's actually, I was joking with the strategery thing, but it's actually a smart aspect of recruiting. Now, Notre Dame just did it to save face. Some of those guys just did it to save face, but there is some strategy involved in that too. And I think Clemson did it more from a strategy standpoint rather than saving face standpoint.
Right. Well, and I'm glad you illustrated it that way, because all that to say is that Notre Dame is on number 2 of the Clemson versus Notre Dame battle for an offensive lineman. And they have a chance to go at worst 2 out of 3 if they're able to close on Absher this Friday. So it's an interesting battle because, again, it's a proximity debate versus a developmental debate from a Notre Dame side. But you have to love where they are for Sullivan Absher, which if you asked me a month ago, I would have still said don't feel great about it. But I feel great about it now. So we're in a good spot.
So that'll be Friday at 4:00. Obviously, we'll carry that one. We'll break it all down for you. We'll have a commitment preview, hopefully that morning before that, and we'll dive into sort of what's next for Notre Dame following whatever the decision that he makes will be. And so, Ryan, let's dive into our next topic of conversation. And our next topic of conversation is kind of looking at where things stand with Notre Dame's kind of new coaches, right? Brian Kelly completely overhauled his coaching staff this offseason, which I think ended up being a positive, right? You get kind of as much of, it's not even a knock on guys like Mike Elston that I thought, did some really nice things at Notre Dame, or other guys that left. It's just more about, you want to make sure that when you're trying to really build the program your way, you have as few people as possible that are going to be saying, we used to, we did it this way, we did it that way. No, it's like, okay, coach, how do you want to do it? Because, I'm kind of new here. And some of the people that were brought back, or one of the person was brought back, wasn't necessarily someone who was on board with the way that it used to be, right? That's obviously Coach Easton. And some of the coaches that were already on staff are guys that Marcus Freeman has either worked with in the past, like Mike Mickens, or a guy like Chris O'Leary, who, even though he was on staff before Coach Freeman arrived, was someone that, Coach Freeman had a big role in promoting him to the safeties coach. So, like, it's a heavy influence of people. Even, you look at things like, the GA on defense, James Laurinaitis, is, former teammate of Marcus Freeman's, right? So you have a very, you were able to kind of overhaul things. And so we talked a lot about when the hires are made of, these are the ones we're excited about. This is what we think is going to happen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But really, you don't know until they get on the road. So we're going to kind of do sort of a midterm report card, right? Ryan? I mean, the reality is we're now in month 5. There's going to
Mm-hmm.
be a signing day in month 12, right? And then there's going to be a couple periods in between here in the summer where, your recruiting is not really allowed, when camp starts and they get those dead periods. And so we're almost to the midway point, and we wanted to kind of do this at the beginning of May to just really look at how the new coach is done and evaluate what they've done so far, and then discuss what they need to do moving forward to really close out and meet their needs and objectives and prove that, like what Coach Freeman said, is you can't be just a coach here, right? Like, you've got to be able to recruit, and we'll find out if that's true or not. And look, we've got to start with the guy that's had the most success so far, right? I mean, the one coach that of all the coaches, and multiple have had really strong influences or impact so far, but the guy that's clearly had the biggest impact so far is Al Washington. I mean, you talk about he's landed 3 commitments so far, and Devin Houston at number 192 overall, according to the 247 Sports Composite. That's your lowest ranked defensive line commitment right now. And think about that. They've got 4 kids committed in 2023, another kid committed in 2025. The lowest ranked guy is Devin Houston at number 192.
Crazy.
Obviously, Keon Keeley and Brendan Vernon were already on this staff, but obviously Coach Washington has been able to play a huge role in landing Boubacar Traore, Devin Houston in the 23 class, and Brandon Davis in 24. So, Ryan, I guess to wrap it up really easily, so far so flipping good for Al Washington when it comes to his early impact on the recruiting trail.
Yeah, I mean, we'll call it a progress report, right? And Al Washington was a Big Ten Recruiter of the Year, right? So we went into this situation where he had been a linebacker coach. What was the defensive line implementation as far as a coach going to look like? We know he had done it in the past, obviously dating back to even his time with Harold Landry at Boston College. So he has had experience in that department, and your expectations were high as a recruiter because just the reputation he had created at Ohio State was impressive to say the least. So he comes in and it's quiet for a little bit, but it's going to be quiet because like you said, you already had Keon Keeley and Brendan Vernon in the class already for him. And of course, Brendan Vernon's a top 100 player by basically everybody. Keon Keeley's a 5-star recruit basically by everybody. And I think the first thing that you do when you step in the door is you have to make sure that those guys are fully on board, right? Like Mike Elston recruited them. We have nothing but positive opinions of Mike Elston as a football coach. You have to now show, hey, I'm Al Washington. I'm different than Mike Elston, but you should still come play for me because I'm a great coach and I'm a great developer and I can do all these great things for you. So that's the first and foremost thing is that you had to get there and you had to keep Keon Keeley in the class. Brendan Vernon, you weren't too worried about that, but Keon Keeley being a 5-star from the state of Florida, you have to make sure that he is fully on board and understands the vision long-term when you're Al Washington. Right. So that's step one. And then we've talked about this. This defensive line class has a chance to be special. Immediately after Boubacar Traore decommits from Boston College, Notre Dame becomes a real player. Coach Washington, of course, a part of that big brigade of, closing now. He makes the move, obviously. And that happens relatively quick after the last visit, obviously. And then Devin Houston's a guy where he closed on him, and the staff closed on him, despite him not being back on campus. So that speaks paramount to the impact that he's had. And then you're just talking to Brandon Davis Swain when I talked to him briefly, but Sean had a chance to go a little more in depth with him, and everything he said about why this was the right time as a 2024 kid in April, right? Or late March, whatever it was. And he is a 2024 kid who is still a sophomore in high school, said, I sat down with Coach Washington and that was it. I didn't need to see anything else. I already liked Notre Dame. As soon as I sat down with him, it was a done deal. So as Notre Dame fans and faithful out there, you should be excited about this because not only do you have a 4-man class in 2023 that is amongst the best, definitely among the best in recruiting right now. Probably will be
hands down the number 1 D-line class right now.
Absolutely.
There's some other schools that maybe can catch them, but if they, but that's going to be when we'll get to what could make that uncatchable. But Ryan, you kind of talk about it. Like when I introduced this subject, I talked about the 3 kids he's landed, right? And which is impressive enough in its own. But I think immediately shifting the focus to Keon Keeley and how important that was is really important, because we're feeling a whole lot different about this D-line class if he gets the 3 he got but lost Keon Keeley. Feeling way different. And
absolutely,
and it kind of started when Coach Washington was hired. Keon had some very public things to say about it that were positive. You're like, whew, okay, cool, good sign. But that was big because, again, Keon Keeley has a chance to be the best prospect in this class for Notre Dame, and I would argue has a chance to be the best non-quarterback in this entire class. Not just for Notre Dame, but in the country. If he can continue developing as a player, he's already a top 5 to 10 type of player. I think he's like number 3 on 3 sports, right? 3 or 4.
Yeah, something like that.
So that was a huge one. And look, it's important. And the first 2 guys we're going to talk about are going to be line coaches, because I wrote an article yesterday, Brian, that look, there's this notion that people say, well, you got to win this way. If you're going to win a championship, you got to do it this way. And I'm not a believer that there's one way to win. LSU won a completely different way than Alabama won their first several titles, right? And LSU, their title in 2019 was different than the one they got in 2007. And you look at Ohio State does it differently. Alabama does theirs. Clemson's done it differently. Like, everybody does it different ways. You have to do what works best for you and your program based on what you can recruit, the systems you want to employ, and then the schedule you play. And so when I look at Notre Dame, for me, I think Notre Dame can get outstanding skill players. There's no doubt. They have been. I mean, they've had multiple first-round draft picks in the last 10, 15 years at receiver. They've had several kids picked in round 2 and 3. They've been able to produce great tight ends and good running backs. And, there was a time back in the day where Notre Dame was pumping out first-round defensive backs every year. But even back then, Notre Dame didn't often have the depth of speed across the board at those places. And I think that's still going to be true. I don't know if Notre Dame's ever going to put a receiving core on the field that's going to look like the one Ohio State put on the field in 2020 that had 3 top 12 draft picks. I don't know if they're ever going to be able to have a receiving core like the one Bama had a few years ago that had 4 first-round draft picks on it, right?
And the Ohio State one might have a top 20 kid next year as well. So
he was also on the 2020 team, right?
Yeah,
and so I don't know if they're going to have that kind of depth. But here's what Notre Dame can and should be able to do. They have to be able to dominate in the trenches on both sides of the ball. And there have been years where, for example, if the 2015 team dominated in the trenches on both sides of the ball, Notre Dame wins the title that year. There's no question in my mind. Now, they should have dominated on both sides of the ball in the trenches because they had NFL players across the board on defense, but there were reasons why. The point, however, is that they didn't dominate, right? We could go back into some, Brady Quinn had some years where if they had the kind of defense that Notre Dame's had the last 3-4 years, that 05 Notre Dame team might have been something if they had a defense like the one they have now, right? And so we could kind of play this game, going back, is there's been years that they've been dominant on one side of the ball, but not the other. And this is a year where, this is a situation where I think based on hiring Al Washington, hiring Harry Heastan, which are 2 huge moves, and the emphasis that they have on recruiting, including Marcus Freeman taking a very personal place, not just with recruiting the defensive line, but when I talked to Elijah Page the other day, and you've had Monroe Freeling tell you the same thing. They don't just talk to Harry Heastan and Tommy Reese. They're talking to Marcus Freeman. And I think that's a big thing. That's a really, really big thing, Ryan, to have your head coach, because you have to be able to dominate in the trenches if you're going to win a championship in Notre Dame. And this class is a huge step. You had a really good class last year, right? Came up a little short in numbers and interior impact. But you combine that with an elite 2023 class, it maybe starts the process where, you're becoming that team that's pumping out NFL players, year after year after year on the D line. Notre Dame's got to get there. The offensive line, we're not worried about. We know it's going to get there as long as Harry Heastan's here. Maybe that's a, blind faith or whatever, but that's just the track record, right? The D line has to show it. I was actually more confident that Al Washington was going to be able to recruit or coach the D line than I was recruited. I know a lot of people were like, oh, he's going to be a great recruiter. I wasn't as sold on that, to be honest with you. The reason I say that is if you look at the great linebacker class he had last year at Ohio State, I think all those kids were from Ohio. I mean, CJ Hicks is from Ohio. Sonny Styles is from Ohio. Reed Powers is from Ohio. I'm trying to think of who the other linebacker was they got in that class. I know I'm drawing a blank here. They had a really good – it was a 4-man class when they added Sonny Styles to it. Give me 1 second. I'm pulling up the list, trying to remember who that 4th guy was in the linebacker class last year. So I said CJ Hicks was from Ohio, Sonny Styles from Ohio. That's 2 5-star kids. Gabe Powers from Ohio. So yeah, it looks like they just got the 3, right? So let me see here. DN. Yeah, they just got the 3. That was a really, really good linebacker class, right? But they were all Ohio kids.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't recruit like that every single year, if we're being honest, right? And then could you then go recruit defensive linemen at a place like Notre Dame that way? That was a different story. You look at the year before, the 2 linebackers they signed the year before, Reed Carrico, who was a 4-star kid, top 250 kid, also from Ohio. You go back to 2020, and it's a very similar story for the most part. You look at the linebacker class, you had Cody Simon from Jersey because Notre Dame didn't push for him. Had a couple guys. Court Williams was in that class, but I don't believe he was recruited by Coach Washington. So I wasn't as sold on it. I needed to see that he could recruit because you can't just recruit a bunch of in-state top 50 kids in Notre Dame. You got to go across the country, and he's done that. Keon Keeley being from Florida, Devin Houston being from Maryland by way of Canada, Boubacar Traore being from Massachusetts, Jason Moore being from Maryland. Like, there is nobody in his backyard he can go get. Brandon Davis-Swain is the closest thing to that. And so I think that's a big, big, big part of this conversation, Ryan, is, I do think he answered some questions for me, and that encourages me even more because I thought the coaching thing would be the one thing I could point to and say, yeah, I saw him coach the BC line. I saw what that group could do. I know he can coach the D-line. The question is, can he recruit against Bama, and can he recruit against Ohio State for Ohio kids? It's easy to recruit Ohio kids to Ohio State, but can you recruit Ohio kids away from Ohio State? Whole different animal. That we didn't know, and so far, so good when it comes to Coach Washington in that regard.
Yeah, and I mean, I like that you point to is kind of, like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, the Harold Landry, obviously, the development, and you just kind of reemphasized that right there. He did an excellent job, and the important part about that was he was the main recruit for Harold Landry and Max Richardson, who's a linebacker at Boston College. They were sneaky good football players, man, because they were not highly rated kids. They were like 3-star recruits. They were not high recruits at all. So that tells me that he can identify talent and he can develop talent.
Right.
And now he's showing you that the Ohio State stuff was not just Ohio. Like, he can go get a Boubacar. He can go get a Devin Houston from Maryland, which is a territory that we have talked about needs to be touched by Notre Dame.
And not one Notre Dame's had a ton of success for recently.
Exactly.
That's the key. And like to the back of the BC point, I mean, we talk about Harold Landry, who had 22 tackles for loss, 16.5 sacks, but often gets lost that year is Kevin Kavalik had 14.5 tackles for loss. Zach Allen was also a defensive lineman on that team. He had 10 tackles for loss. Those guys could get after the quarterback. Zach Allen and Kevin Kavalik combined for 10.5 sacks, which is pretty impressive when you consider the other defensive end had 16.5. Right. And so when you look at it, you say, if he can get BC kids to play at that level, I know he can get the kids that Notre Dame's going to have.
Yep.
So it's a really big thing for him. Now, he's done a really good job. I would argue that right now Notre Dame has a chance to have a top 5 to 7 D-line class right now. And that might be too low because of, you have a Keon Keeley. But to me, to really make this a generational D-line class, one that you just look and say, boy, we haven't seen a class like this at Notre Dame in a long time. He's got to close on Jason Moore, in my opinion. Like, to me, Jason Moore is the difference between, man, you had an excellent D-line class. You got a 5-star, you got some really good football players. Man, those kids are all starters, and you're gonna be good to go. But to have that one where people talk about this D-line class, kind of like they have past Georgia classes and Alabama classes, and to a degree the A&M class last year, you need Jason Moore. You need that second truly elite prospect. All the other guys are top 50 to 100 guys, in my opinion. Devin Houston's a top 150 guy. Jason Moore, to me, is a top 50 guy right now in the gap between him, where he is as a top 50 guy and being a 5-star is not that great. It's one good offseason, and he could be that guy. That's going to be the key for Coach Washington. Can you really close it out, bat 1,000, and get that final piece to make this a in my opinion, what would be a generational defensive line class for Notre Dame. And what a way to start your Notre Dame career. He might want to rethink this whole thing because he's like, well, now people are going to expect this from me every year. You know what I mean? Like, there's nowhere to go but down. I say kiddingly, but no, but in seriousness, Jason Moore, getting him has to be the final piece of this to really take this thing over the top.
Yeah, I mean, you quantified it perfectly. It goes from a really good class to an elite class if you get Jason Moore, a program-changing type of class. Like, I think when you think of Coach Washington, obviously, with his Ohio State ties, when you think of Ohio State when they've been at their best, they're trotting out the Bosas that go right into Chase Young, that go into the next great defensive end. Like, that's just what that's when Ohio State's been at the best. And I think you need to see a similar thing at Notre Dame now, right? Like, you need to see a pipeline of great great players at that position, because the defensive end position is so important. And if you're able to walk out off the bus, Keon Keeley, Jason Moore, Brennan Vernon, they're all walking together. Man, that is a difficult sight to see for an opposing offensive coordinator. Let's be honest, man. Like, those guys are impressive looking dudes. And I agree with you, and I want to emphasize it more for people, because I feel like we talk about Jason obviously a lot, but I don't think that we really, at least I don't think I've done it enough to just kind of say this for a second. I think that Jason Moore is a top 50 player right now, like you just said, but this kid is legitimate upside, like top 15 to 20 player in the country if he hits his ceiling. I think he's that special of a player. This is not just a throw-in type of player. Like, this guy in most years is the best defensive lineman you're going to sign. This guy is a special football player.
I mean, you talk about like the defensive line Notre Dame faced in 2018 against Clemson, right? I mean, the kid on the opposite end of, I'm trying to remember the kid's name, the kid that was the lower pick for Clemson in 2016. I had to take a nap. Yeah, Kevin Dodd. He was a really good football player.
Yep.
But you look at the rest of that line. You had Clellan Farrell was a top 5 pick. He had 19 and a half tackles for loss. Christian Wilkins was an elite player, first round pick, 15 tackles for loss. Austin Bryant that's who I was thinking of. Austin Bryant. Kevin Dodd was Shaq Lawson. You had Xavier Thomas. You had Dexter Lawrence. Like, you just had like big time NFL players across the board, and you think about what that team was able to do, just blow out Notre Dame, because Notre Dame couldn't score on them. Alabama couldn't score on them. Like, you couldn't score on that defense when they were healthy. And Notre Dame didn't have to face Dexter Lawrence. People forget he was suspended. He didn't even play in the postseason. So, I mean, that tells you how good that unit was. And you're looking at a similar type of group if they can get Jason Moore.
And you know what else too is, we've talked about the linebacker recruiting in recent years. Obviously, Clemson had Isaiah Simmons, who was a linebacker safety. He was that hybrid role, right? The one that Trenton Simpson now plays for Clemson. But Clemson really hasn't had great inside linebackers during their time. They've had really good college players like Ben Boulware and then James Skalski and like that brand of player. But
Trey
imagine
Lamar, Kendall Joseph.
Who are good, solid players. Obviously not NFL players.
Right. Because Trey Lamar was a good all ACC player, big, thick kid, but he went undrafted. Right.
Exactly.
I mean, to your point.
Yeah. And I'm just imagining a world if Notre Dame's able to put together this class in a couple years. We're talking about guys like Drake Bowen, Jalen Sneed, that type of player playing behind him. Man, it's just the speed that you have on the first, second, and third level potentially just because of this recruiting class. Just because of 2023, it could be special. It really could be.
James Lawrence Zensi had a great, I mean, I get where people are talking about. Once our 2022 linebackers with the 2023 defensive line class get a little older, I don't care who they line up on offense. I think that's where that excitement comes from. And again, we're not even talking about how, they've got a top 50 recruited linebacker in this year's class, right? And they did so well in last year's linebacker class. They've already moved Josh Burnham to defensive end. Right. I mean, again, you've got to be able to dominate in the trenches. I did want to address one thing that was brought up, Ryan, when we were talking about it from Quinn. He said, but didn't Washington not get Vernon out of Ohio when he was at Ohio State? Sorry if I misunderstand the point you made. He didn't recruit Brennan Vernon. He was the linebackers coach at Ohio State. He recruited linebackers. And, of course, he had his region. Somebody asked about Travion Henderson. He was the number 2 to Travion. He was the regional recruiter, right? But that was a Tony Alford deal, right? It's you look at the success he had, it was recruiting the linebacker position. He was the linebackers coach at Ohio State. So Larry Johnson was the one responsible for getting or not getting defensive linemen, and it was him who they beat for Brennan Vernon, not Al Washington. Mm-hmm. So just want to make sure that we're clear on that. So let's move on, Ryan.
Mhm.
Offensive line. So obviously here Houston got on the board here in the last couple of weeks when he landed Sam Pendleton, 4-star kid out of North Carolina, Ronald Reagan High School. And said, I think it's probably Pfafftown or Pafftown, so we'll see if it's Pfafftown. So
Yes.
one of those is probably going to be silent. I'm not sure which one it is. You get him. That was a really unique recruitment. As we said earlier, that was a good start for Coach Houston, but it's one of those ones where I kind of felt like once they got involved, Notre Dame was going to be hard to beat. It's just, but then you got to give Coach Houston the credit for that, because why? Why was Notre Dame going to be hard to beat? It's because of the tradition that was started by who? Harry Houston, right?
Right.
So he gets some credit, but the point is, it wasn't like it was let's be honest, it wasn't a super challenging recruitment. Right.
Sure.
I've accused Jeff Quinn of winning not challenging recruitments in the past. We're going to be fair when we look at Coach Houston. That's one you should have won. I mean, that shouldn't have been a difficult one. The rest are going to be harder, right? And even the kids that like Notre Dame, like a Monroe Freeling, like a Sullivan Absher, like a Charles, Jagasol, like some of those, Elijah Page, Samson Okunlola, those are going to be a little harder. Because even though they love Coach Houston and the tradition he's built, there's also a lot of attraction to other programs, whether it be local or up and coming and those type of things. And so we're going to learn a lot about, Coach Houston's ability to really do what he did the first time, which is go across the country, get the guys that you want, that you think have the really high ceilings, and turn them into elite linemen. That's what he did the last time around. We're going to have to find out, because, again, good start with Pendleton. But we're really going to find out if he's that recruiter moving forward. And it's going to come down to his ability to not only get Sullivan Absher, but can you close on Monroe Freeling? Can you close on Charles Jagasol? Can you add that fifth guy? That's going to be the thing that's going to really tell us if he's back to being an elite recruiter of top offensive linemen.
Said perfectly. Pendleton's a really good start. He's obviously I don't want to say premier. He's a ideal interior player in this class, whether he winds up as guard or as center, maybe even long term. He's a really good first addition to this class. But for me, Coach Houston, and he has obviously a reputation as a really good recruiter. So we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. And he has started off this where we talked about Sullivan Absher a bunch to start this show. He has, I think, flipped Notre Dame into their favor, obviously, in that recruitment. Now, the important part of this is that you do not want to leave this recruitment without at least 1 to 2 true offensive tackles. And we've talked about that a ton in the past.
Mm-hmm.
You need to get a Monroe Freeling and a Charles Jagasol. You need those players in this class, because if you get again, and obviously Austin Sareveld is now off the board, committed to Ohio State. But if you would have gotten Austin Sareveld, Sam Pendleton, then you would have got a Sullivan Absher, like those types of players who may all end up being interior players down the line, then you're going to get in trouble with the numbers type of conversation. But a guy like Monroe Freeling is a true left tackle. You know this. Charles Jagasol could be a right tackle. Maybe he's a guard eventually. Maybe Sullivan Absher could stick a tackle. The balancing of tackles and interior player in this class, I think, is absolutely huge. And they've put themselves in a great position. You have Pendleton already committed. You've put yourself in great position with Absher. You put yourself in a really good position with Monroe Freeling. You have to close that one. And you've been in a good spot with Charles Jagasol for a while. It just has not closed yet.
Right.
So closing on those guys is paramount. But again, if everything happens, and right now, I would say that Notre Dame is the leader for all 4 of those guys I mentioned, because obviously Pendleton's in the class, so they are obviously his leader. The other 3, I think they're in a really good spot, and then we'll see what happens with a guy like Elijah Page maybe down the line, or a Joe Otting that was just offered recently. Like maybe he's a guy long-term play. We'll see what happens with that recruitment. But if you land all of the players right now in this class at offensive line that you are currently in the lead for, Harry Houston has answered any question of anybody that wants to know if he still has the fire to be a recruiter.
And just so we're clear, Ryan, you believe, and I now believe, I didn't before with Absher, obviously because he wasn't, but now you believe that Notre Dame is the leader for Freeling, Jagasol, and Absher, correct?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah. And I think they're going to be a player with Elijah Page, but I don't think they lead for him. I think they got to get him on campus, and that's still a relatively new relationship. Joe Otting, I think if they make a push for him and they want him, I think they could get him as well from the early things I've been told. But I think the tackle part is important, because I think that's why, to me, that's why I think you've got to hit a home run on. You've got to hit the inside straight on those three we just talked about. You've got, because I think two things. Number one, right? This is why this is so important, because all three of those kids are looking at schools that you need to kind of conquer or keep behind you. And this is an important part of this. Like, this is one of the things we don't talk enough about in recruiting. It's not the reason it's, you need to shop down the right aisle, right? Not, a different aisle that is for the lazy recruiter who doesn't want to put in the work. But the reason you need to shop down the same aisle as Alabama and Ohio State and Clemson and Oklahoma and Georgia and teams like that is because when you beat them for kids, you're not just adding a really good player to your team, you're keeping one from them. And that's huge. And when you talk about Notre Dame, who are the programs right now that are clearly just are ahead of Notre Dame? And when you look at the last 3-4 years from a production on the field standpoint, from an NFL production standpoint, from a recruiting standpoint, to me, Ryan, it's really only 3 schools that 4 schools. There's only really 4 schools, right? And we all know them. It's Alabama, Georgia. And that was true even before they won the title, because they beat Notre Dame twice, and they had been to the playoff and actually won playoff games, something Notre Dame never did. Right. Ohio State, obviously, and then Clemson. Well, if you look at Clemson right now, and if you're going to put together the defensive line class that you're in the process of putting together, and Clemson beats you for 2 of those 3 kids, they now have an offensive line class coupled with the 2 kids I really like that they got from last year. They got a kid from Ohio that I really like, big, strong kid. They got the kid from their own state that I really like. So they got 2 good players last year. They were a little short on numbers, but they had 2 good players. If they're able to add Monroe Freeling and Sullivan Absher to the class, all of a sudden, like, hey, you know what? They're putting blockers together that maybe can keep you from dominating them the way that you can. But if you get the defensive line class and you beat them for Monroe Freeling and Sullivan Absher and Sam Pendleton, all of a sudden, now that's how you dominate them in the trenches. Right? Because you've been able to you've not only added great offensive linemen to your team to help you handle their elite defensive line, but you've now taken away their top offensive line targets that are going to make it a lot harder for them to stop your defensive line. Because the one thing that kept Notre Dame in that game in 2018, the matter of fact, the only thing that really kept them in the game, 2 things. One, that was one of those weird years where Notre Dame had 2 really good corners. Right? But the biggest reason those corners had success is because Notre Dame's defensive line flat whipped Clemson's offensive line in that game. Flat whipped them. Now, Notre Dame couldn't do anything on the other side of the ball, but that side of the ball held up. And that was with a good offensive line. But you start taking away their top targets from them, Ryan, you've not only built yourself up, you're now tearing down a team that's ahead of you. It's why it's important to beat Ohio State for Brendan Vernon. It's important to beat Ohio State for kids that they want. It's important to beat Georgia and Alabama because you've taken guys they want, and that's going to hurt them, and impact players that they want. And I think that adds even more value to why it's important that Coach Heastan have this, and Coach Reese and Coach Chad Bowden have the success that they need to have when it comes to putting together this elite offensive line. It not only builds you up, but it tears down one of the programs you're trying to chase. Because like putting distance between yourself and Michigan with Jagasaw, that's important, right? But it's not as important as catching and beating and passing Clemson. It's incredibly important for Notre Dame to do that, which adds even more intrigue to what Coach Heastan has a chance to do on the recruiting trail this year.
No, it's perfectly said again. I always root for, beating Michigan for anything. But like you said, the fact that Notre Dame is beating a team like a Clemson for several key targets, if they were going to beat an Ohio State, if they're going to keep Keon Keeley in the class that an Alabama really wants, right? That is trying to get him in the class. That's the difference there. Beating the best teams in college football for players that they want. And for Notre Dame to separate themselves, like you just said, they need to be able to do that. So yes, I think that we have seen, and we've seen it in the past, right? Coach Heastan, and you've said it before, Brian, it's like he identifies and he go gets his class. He keeps the board small because he knows he's going to get his guys. And I think that it is important. I do think it is because, when he got hired, a lot of people had speculation that he's not going to want to recruit. He's getting older, right? Like he doesn't want to recruit anymore. If he's able to pull this class that he potentially can, I think that's a big exclamation point that obviously he wants to be here. He wants to
Right.
build something great, and he wants to be a part of Marcus. And one thing we didn't talk about is that we're examining new hires for very different like demographic of people and backgrounds and resumes. And the fact that Coach Houston wanted to come back for Marcus Freeman when he doesn't have anything else to prove. He built offensive line U. He doesn't have anything to prove. He wants to be here, and he wants to be a part of the ideology that Marcus Freeman brings. Right. That I think is important.
I think it also says a lot too, Ryan, about the staff that Coach Freeman can put together and his ability to manage a staff, right? That's such an important thing. Can you not only hire good coaches, but can you get all those coaches like you just said, different age groups, different backgrounds, different all types of different things. They're very different dudes. Can you get them all came from different schools? Can you get them all immediately going in the right direction? It says a lot about Coach Freeman's ability to lead, but also that he is a guy that guys want to be led by. And I think that's an important thing. The fact that, I don't want to get off tangent too much, but the fact that Notre Dame is now concerned about how does the roster going to shake out, because they expected guys to jump in the portal and nobody jumped in the portal. Why? Because everybody wants to play for Coach Freeman. Right now, guys jumped in the portal that had a place to come back to, right? Like Sebo Flemister and some of those guys got in the portal, but that's because they didn't have an invitation back because they were seniors, and fifth year senior thing is more of you're not entitled to that kind of thing. Right. So it really is. It says a lot. It says a lot. Before we move on, Shelton Hager 91 with a super chat. Been a while, Shelton. Maybe just because it's been a while for live viewing. Love you guys. Much love to you, Brian, Vince, Ryan, and Sean. Yeah, Shelton, we haven't seen you in a while on the board or here. Hope you and your family are doing well, man. Hope you and your wife's doing a lot better, and hope you guys are doing well, man. You're still in our prayers. There's no doubt about it. It's good seeing you back in the show, buddy. Absolutely love seeing you back in the show. So thank you very, very much for the super chat. Ryan, I think the coach that Marcus Freeman hired, that was the biggest question mark in every single facet, was Chancey Stuckey. He'd been a coach for 1 year. He had not even seen a full recruiting cycle through, because he didn't arrive at Baylor till like just January the year before. The cycle had already begun. Doesn't even like complete like a full year there, like a full class there. I mean, they signed a class, but it was like, he got a late start on it, and it was an unknown. What can this guy do? I have no idea. He's been a football coach for 1 year, and so far, obviously we liked what we saw from him in the fall as a coach. That was probably the thing that I was least concerned about, because I felt like, look, as a former receiver, played in the NFL, this guy knows the game. I assume he'll be able to teach it, to some level degree. And the bar was so low from a coaching standpoint, it was going to be hard for him not to get there. But I think when I look at the other aspect of it, the recruiting piece was the bigger question mark for me. And so far, man, look, again, he's got one commitment. That's Braylon James. And he's going to ultimately be judged not on where Notre Dame stands as the leader or not with top players now, but can they sign top players? I think that's going to be the thing that is going to ultimately determine whether or not he's judged his success. But we're not there yet, right? There's a midterm. Through the midterm, it's hard not to be impressed with what Coach Stuckey's done, not just with who he's landed, but where Notre Dame stands with a lot of very, very talented wide receivers.
Yeah, if we're talking about this progress report type of conversation, right? Al Washington's the best in class, but that's only because 3 of the last 4 commits that we've had have been defensive linemen, obviously, for Notre Dame, right? But the person I would say, Brian, that has been talked about most from recruits, the guy's name that you hear so often, is Chancey Stuckey. And it's always unprompted. Even if it's not, and it's funny because it's not always just the wide receiver recruits either. People just talk about Chancey Stuckey, about how great of a guy he is. And then obviously he gets on the board with Braylon James, which is a fantastic player, top 100 ranked player out of the state of Texas. And he has obviously a previous relationship with him because he was at Baylor. And like you said, doesn't have a ton of experience recruiting, but he does know Braylon. And then we're like, okay, what's next now, right? And then this blue gold visit, he knocks it out of the park with both Jaden Greathouse, which again, Texas kid, first offer he got was from Baylor. He has a relationship with him. some people would expect that, like, okay, he's making rounds with guys that he had previous relationships with. Makes sense. But the fact that Rodney Gallagher left that visit, and even if they don't end up with Rodney Gallagher, I think it speaks volumes to the fact of how much ground a person can make up in such a short amount of time and just the impact that he can have on guys in the recruiting world. I think that it says a lot for what Coach Stuckey has been able to do so far. The Carnell Tate thing, that's not anything to blame, in my opinion, on Chancey Stuckey. There's just other factors in that recruitment. That is not a Chancey Stuckey miss, quote unquote, right?
If NIL wasn't a thing, we would be having a different conversation about that.
Right, exactly. So I think that right now, Chancey Stuckey has probably answered the most questions of the new hires, I would say, in my opinion anyway. And I think he has a chance to, we've talked about it plenty of times, wide receiver recruiting from a depth standpoint this year and from a talent perspective. You needed to sign a really good class. And if they're able to land on top of a Braylon James, a Jaden Greathouse in theory, and they pull, I don't want to call it an upset because I don't think Rodney Gallagher ever had a leader per se, but it would still be a huge monumental win to go into Pennsylvania, a place that's been kind of absent from your recruiting prowess recently. Yeah. And to get a guy like a Rodney Gallagher, I think would be would be massive, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, and there's other guys. Look, I think the recruitment we're not talking about enough that's super important for Notre Dame is Ronan Hannafin. And, you know, we talk about Greathouse and Gallagher and they're highly ranked guys and they're talented players. And I don't take anything away from them as players. I mean, they're excellent players. I mean, Rodney Gallagher to me is a top 100 recruit. I talked about this on the message board today at Irish Breakdown that, you know, my view on Jaden Greathouse has changed. And, you know, Ryan's adjusting his camera right now, so we'll get him on there so he can hear me when I say this. But, you know, one of the reasons is because, you know, talking to Ryan, and he was adamant that Jaden Greathouse was better than I thought he was. And so I did a deeper dive in his film and watch some game film. And, you know, my opinion on him has changed a little bit. And I now see a top 100 caliber player because that's just what you got to do. Sometimes you got to get your own biases out of the way. But he's a really talented player. And then take away the ranking, you just look at how the fit would be with him and with Gallagher and all that. But the reason we don't talk about Ronan Hannafin enough, more than some of the other things we joked about the other day, is he's just not a highly ranked recruit. But the fact of the matter is, I don't care. Do you trust Rivals and 247 and On 3 and Irish Breakdown? Or do you trust the coaches at Notre Dame, Alabama, Clemson, Oklahoma, Ohio State, USC, Georgia, right? LSU? You get the point? Okay, maybe not LSU. But you get the point on the rest of them. And those schools are pushing hard for Ronan Hannafin. I mean, Nick Saban and that offensive staff at Alabama wants Ronan Hannafin bad at wide receiver.
Right.
Clemson is pushing for him hard as a wide receiver. With all due respect, if those teams want a kid at receiver with their track record, I'm listening, right? I'm listening. And so we're not talking enough about him. And, you know, when you and I had some fun today talking about comparisons and style of play comparisons, and the one that he really reminds me of, and it kept popping in my head as I was trying to think of a comparison for Ronan Hannafin that wasn't a lazy one. And just Chris Godwin from Penn State kept popping up in my head, you know, and, you know, that guy was a heck of a player at Penn State. And when he's been healthy, he's been a heck of a player in the NFL, you know, at least statistically. So to me, he's not a guy we're talking about enough about as far as not just, okay, would he be like people say, would he be a nice fourth edition? I don't know if he would rank fourth if they signed the four we talked about, right? I mean, especially from an offer list standpoint, he's another guy that's a very important pickup because the reason I say that is as good as Jaden Greathouse is and Rodney Gallagher is and Braylon James is, Braylon to a degree and Jaden Greathouse to a degree, they're battling the big boys for. Rodney Gallagher's being slept on a little bit. For whatever reason, the Ohio States, the Bamas, the Clemsons, they're not pushing for him, which their mistake is going to be Notre Dame's gain, hopefully. But there's not a player on the board that Notre Dame is going to have to battle the big boys more than Ronan Hannafin, and that's what we talked about, right? Like, yes, those other guys are great players, but if you land Ronan Hannafin, and right now I'm not as confident as I was about this 2 months ago. I'm not. Look, for a host of reasons, which, you know, we talked about on the message board, but you're going to have to beat Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and Oklahoma if you want to get Ronan Hannafin. And that in itself is not only adding a big time player, but that's another aspect of it. And so to me, for Chancey Stuckey, for Marcus Freeman, for Chad Bowden, because this is going to have to be a team effort, that's one that could end up being the hardest of all of them to get because for whatever reason, as much as Ronan likes Notre Dame, he's decided he wants to see this thing through. And you get to a point where you may have, as a staff, to kind of start making some decisions in late June. Like, look, we love you, Ronan. You're a top guy. You're a must get, but we can't afford to not get a fourth receiver in this class. And when I say fourth, just pure number, because I think, you're going to get into situations where, Rico Flores is making his commitment known on July 3rd. Rodney Gallagher's making a commitment on July 4th. I could see a scenario in which Jaden Greathouse is ready to make his decision. Right now, I think Notre Dame would rather have Ronan Hannafin than Rico and Malik Elzy and some of those guys. But you get into July, and if Ronan's not giving you an indication that he's ready to wind this thing down, you may be forced to say, we've got to go with somebody else because we can't afford to see this thing through and then miss. And that's what's going to make it interesting. But to me, that's the sort of the dream class right now of guys they're on. And then there's guys like Tyler Williams and guys like that. That's when you really see if they've got something going on. But, right now, I think that's going to be a tough one. I'm not going to really spend too much time talking about him until he gets on campus, but he's got a chance to finish. But that's going to be the key, Ryan. You've got to finish, right? And I think with Greathouse, I would say you have the best shot at right now with Greathouse. We could kind of go back and forth on whether Hannafin or Gallagher. I think we both agree that Notre Dame leads or is at least in the lead group and has a good shot to close, but they've got to do exactly that. They've got to close. And neither one of those kids will be on campus at Notre Dame last. They both will have visits after Notre Dame, which we'll address with another question that we have down here. So big opportunity for Chancey Stuckey. Great start, but closing is going to be the key.
Yeah. I mean, if you would have told me a couple months ago that Notre Dame would maybe have a better chance at some point for Jaden Greathouse comparative to a Ronan Hannafin, I probably would have shook my head. Like that's not a tangible thing. That's not possible, right?
Right.
But like you said, I mean, Ronan Hannafin's offer list rivals the best in the nation. Like it is a impressive. I mean, you mentioned all the schools, and USC also offered as well. So, and I know a lot of wide receivers probably want to play with Lincoln Riley. Like that's just a natural thing, right? So, yeah, it's going to be a tough pull, but if you're able to get both the Texas kids in the class that you've been recruiting, a Rodney Gallagher who's a really quick twitch slot that you just don't really have on the roster right now, and then Ronan Hannafin brings, and I really want people to understand this again because we don't talk enough about Ronan Hannafin. We don't for a lot of reasons, but I would say here that from the moment me and Brian talked about him when I first came on the Irish Breakdown, I think one of the first things we talk about, Brian, is like, how is this kid not a 4-star recruit? Like this kid's a really good player, man. So yeah, it has a chance to be something special. We are off to a great start. We feel that Coach Stuckey is changing a narrative that was, billed as him because again, he just didn't have the experience. And if he's able to pull off that type of class, then all of a sudden there's no question marks anymore. Because I mean, just seeing him in person, I would be very surprised if the wide receiver group, just in general, from a coaching perspective, wasn't much better coached this upcoming season than in previous years. I would.
And that's
be shocked.
a low bar. That's a pretty low bar. Exactly. I think the question is how much better, right? Exactly. How much better. Yep. And that's going to be the key. And I expect, it's already better. It's just how much better is going to be the key. And that leads into the next part of it, Ryan, is if you go put a better product on the field, all of a sudden it makes it a little easier to do this thing the next go around in 2024.
Absolutely. And 2024 looks like a really good wide receiver group early on, doesn't it? I mean, Ryan Wingo and Ryan Pelham and Zion Reagans, and there's a lot of really talented wide receivers in 2024. If you're able to close on a couple of these guys quickly, gets the class you want, then all sights for 2024. But got to close.
So another coach that we want to discuss is Coach Dylan McCullough. And he's had an interesting one, right? So he inherits a running back in 2023, inherits a running back in 2022 who is already signed and on campus by the time he was hired. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, what are you going to do? Okay, I'm gonna see your 23 commitments, and I'm going to get you a 2022 kid, right? I mean, he goes out and gets Jabron Payne. It's one of those ones where it's a good pickup, but it doesn't necessarily tell us a lot about his ability to recruit at Notre Dame. Right. And because he had already gotten him to sign with him in Indiana, there was all that relationship. Notre Dame was the biggest school that was pushing for him. And then you look at the 2023 class and it's like, well, it's a really down year at running back. there's really only, as a buddy and I were kind of going over this yesterday, Ryan, and we were kind of going over the running back class and just how mediocre it really is this year. And we're kind of looking at running backs. We're like, okay, obviously Cedric Baxter's legit, right? Like, I don't know if you had a chance to see Cedric Baxter, but he's legit. He's a really good football player. He's a top back. Yeah, he's a top back in any year. Justice Haynes is a really good player. I don't think he's the elite back that some make him out to be. Like Rivals has him as the number one back in the class. He's not that. Richard Young's a really good back, in my opinion. But it's just after that, it kind of like there's a good backs, but there's not a lot of elite backs. Then obviously he set his sights on Jaden Lamar, and Notre Dame is making a push for him. That's a very telling recruitment. Can you get him from the West Coast? I would imagine Jalen's recruitment will be over sooner rather than later. And can you close out on him is going to be a test for him. But the real test for Dylan McCullough is really going to be 2024. I think that's going to be the test for him because he's in a situation where he can't go out and recruit a bunch of backs because A, there aren't a lot of backs in this class. B, you already have a back in your class. So that adds a little bit of intrigue to it. We're going to learn a lot more about him over the next year than we will over the next couple months. And I think he's going to make a splash and has already made a splash, but it's hard for him. Like there isn't a Monroe Freeling out there for him to get in this class. There isn't a Braylon James out there for him to get in this class, a Keon Keeley, a Jason Moore for him to get in this class. It's just that guy's not out there in our opinion. So his situation is a little bit different. And we're also going to talk about, Jared Parker, similar situation. Actually, let's just kind of talk about them both now, Ryan, is he inherits a top 150 player and they're kind of done. The only kid that they would still like to get is Deuce Robinson, who's a, 5-star caliber guy. But because you dropped him for months before Jared Parker got hired, that's an impossible task to ask. In my opinion. So he's another guy. We're going to learn a lot more about Jared Parker as a recruiter in 2024 than we are in 2023 from an identification standpoint. Can you ID top players and then can you go get them? So those are two guys that right now, if I were to give them a grade, it would sort of be, an incomplete, or to be determined, or maybe say, hey, they've maybe this would be they've kind of tested out of the first half of the class, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like they're not being graded on the same way that the other coaches are, simply because the opportunity is not there for them to go out and make that kind of splash. So we're going to learn a lot more about them, and that's going to be key. Like, Jared Parker, okay, can you identify who you guys want and go get them early? Maybe you can get these guys early since you don't have a lot of 2023 stuff to worry about other than helping on some other guys. I think that's so when you look at Dylan McCullough, they've already started offering some running backs. You and I both love that kid from Wisconsin. Like, if he's able to go up there and get that kid, it's like, okay, mission accomplished. But that's not it. I mean, there's a lot of good backs in the 2024 class. It's early yet, but it's definitely looking like a better class nationally than the 2023 class from a depth standpoint. Would you agree with that, Ryan?
Yeah, from everyone I've seen so far. I mean, you're talking about Corey Smith, who's obviously a really talented player out of the state of Wisconsin. Stacy Gage from IMG is a legit back. There's
Davion Gase,
Davion Gase, yeah.
What's a Brian Jackson? That's a kid that they've offered
out
from
of Texas.
He's a big boy.
He's it's
Anthony Carey. They've already offered a scholarship. They're still recruiting Cameron Davis, who's committed to Florida State. He's a talented back. He has some interest in Notre Dame. Jared Gibson, Nathaniel Palmer. I mean, so they've already thrown some offers out. Stacy Gage, they're not going to. They're not in that one, right? Like that's not one that they're in on. But a lot of these other guys you look at and say, hey, look, these are guys that I think they have a shot with. These are guys that they got to go out and they've got to get one of those guys, right? That's going to be the key for Coach McCullough. And then for Coach Parker, it's like, okay, you're at tight end, right? Don't make the mistake the last guy made. And John McNulty did some really good things in Notre Dame as a position coach. But he kind of recruited like he was at Rutgers early on, and when you got Jack Nickel and, they caught some breaks and they ended up with a really good class last year. But it's like, don't make that early mistake that you can't recover from. Don't get a guy like Cooper Flanagan, who we like. You should have got Cooper Flanagan and then stop, right? Like those are the mistakes that he made. And, look, let's be honest. They don't get Eli Raritan if his dad and grandpa weren't graduates of Notre Dame. Can we say that? He's not picking Notre Dame after you ignored him for several months if he doesn't have those family ties. And so he's going to have to not make those mistakes. and go out next year in 2024 and say, here's the elite players at this position. Go out and get them, because you should be getting Michael Mayer types all the time. And, that's a big part of this whole thing.
I can't believe they ignored Eli Raritan. I mean, he runs a 1.4 something 10-yard split, right?
I know, right? I can't believe somebody reported that. Like, that's like, you're telling me Eli Raritan, 5 months removed from a torn ACL and surgery, is putting up better 10-yard splits than Kyle Pitts did at the NFL Scouting Combine? Come on.
I mean, that if it was truthfully a 1.4 something, that's like a cornerback elite time.
That's elite corner speed. That was bad.
Exactly.
That was better than Kevin Austin. Come on, guys. Like, can we just, and then you have to like talk people off of like, look, he didn't. I promise you, he did not run that less 5 months removed from ACL surgery.
Yeah,
And
if you're on the message board, you know that little shot I just took. I'm sorry.
You just had to get me fired up on that one.
I had to take it, man. I saw that number 2 and I'm like, guys, that doesn't make any sense. But yeah. I'm glad that we coupled McCullough and Parker together, though. I think that was
because they're in unique situations. Yeah.
No, I'm starting a kind of a mini series that's going to be coming out soon. That I'm basically doing kind of a report card type of thing, at least like a progress report, however we want to kind of phrase it. But it's true. I mean, you fall into 2 positions that are not going to traditionally carry a lot of recruits. Like, it's not like an offensive line coach where you're going to have 4 to 5 recruits, 3, whatever it might be. There's multiple positions, right? We're talking about a tight end that in this class, there's going to be 1 to 2 players. And then we're talking a running back who we have 1 player in with Cedric Irvin Jr., obviously, and you can hold a second. So at most, each of these classes are holding 2 players. And both these coaches walk in with 1 guy already committed. We mentioned Cedric Irvin Jr. at running back. We mentioned Cooper Flanagan at tight end. Both good players. There's no doubt about it. But you've put yourself in a position, if you're Coach Parker, you're pretty much going elite or bust, right? Like, it's either you're going to get a guy.
Bust. That's really it. There's only one tight end worth taking, because I'd rather use that extra scholarship on a 5th defensive lineman, 5th offensive lineman, 5th receiver, 5th, 6th DB, 4th. I'd rather use that on anyone else than a second tight end in this class, unless that second tight end is Deuce Robinson.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, that to your point, yes, correct.
Yeah, no. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So it's Deuce or bust. If it ends up not being Deuce, you're still in a good spot with the Cooper Flanagan, because he's a top 150 kid by a couple different platforms. He's a good football player. Cedric Irvin Jr., like we've kind of highlighted in the past, good, solid football player. You're in the conversation with the Jaden Lamar. It's a situation where you can bring in a second back. But like you said, Brian, the imprint of Coach McCullough and Coach Parker on these programs from a recruiting standpoint is not going to be quantified by 2023. 2024 is going to be the class, because they walked into a class that already had a committed each position. So, again, perfect point there.
What'll be interesting is if, like, maybe they can get a Jeremiah Love. Could he have an impact on getting a Jeremiah Love, who maybe isn't a running back specifically, but can he play a role in getting him, who's more of an athlete kind of guy? And that could be it too. And then the final coach is the one that I would say right now is the biggest mystery, right? And that is Al Golden. We've heard his name a little bit, but not a ton. And a big reason for that is he was hired right before spring ball. And then, of course, the focus then is on the team, spring ball. He's just now getting on the road. And from everything we've been told, this is really his, going into his 2nd week on the road. That's it. We're going to start learning a lot more about Al Golden here over the next month or 2. What role does he play in closing on Jason Moore? What role does he play in maybe getting them more in the game with a Caleb Downs, right? So Chris O'Leary and those guys have all done their job. Now it's out. Can Al Golden help take you, further? Can he help maybe close the deal with Jason Moore along with Coach Freeman? What impact can he have on the linebacker recruit? So we're going to learn a lot more about Al Golden, because unlike the 2 coaches we just talked about, there are players at his position on the board that he has to get. Right now, Notre Dame has a really good linebacker class with Drake Bowden, who's a top 50 recruit, and Preston Zenter, who's a top 250 kind of guy, right? But to really be an elite program, you've got to recruit that position and all positions really for the most part, but you've got to be able to put them, stack them on top of each other. And for this linebacker class to be able to match last year's linebacker class, you need to get Jaden Nosberry, in my opinion. Because I'm still not 100% sold Samuel Mpemba stays a linebacker. I'm not even close to 100% sold on that. You need to get a Jaden Nosberry or a Darren Gillette. You have to do it, right? To really say, hey, look, you're going out and compete with the big boys on the recruiting trail just like they are, right? You got to get one of the two, in my opinion. And so we're going to learn a lot about his ability as a main recruiter, but even more importantly, because look, with Marcus Freeman, recruiting linebackers shouldn't be as hard as maybe it is in other places. You've got James Laurinaitis and Marcus Freeman on your staff, right? That should help. Where I think we're really going to find out about Al Golden is, and he's talked a lot about wanting to be at Notre Dame and want to be a part of Notre Dame, but is he going to fall into the trap of other NFL coaches that come back to college with their eye on maybe other jobs that don't invest in recruiting the way that they invest in coaching? Joe Brady be an example. I think Coach Marone from Alabama last year falls into that category. That's something that I think is legit. And look, I'm not saying that based on any evidence of anything specific to Al Golden. This is more of what we've seen from other coaches with similar pedigrees in the past. Former head coach, right? Former, NFL coach. He's not coming to Notre Dame to be the defensive coordinator the next 15 years, right? Like, this isn't his retirement job. I would imagine he's young enough that he still has aspirations. But are you going to fully commit while you're here? That's a legitimate question that's not specific to Al Gold for anything he's done, but it was to be true of anyone coming in with his resume. And the biggest impact he's going to have, in my opinion, is can you help close the deal with the top dudes on the board? The linebackers we talked about, Jason Moore, the corners, Caleb Downs, guys like that. That's where he's going to get a chance to really make his presence felt. And that ultimately is where he's going to be judged on, in my opinion, even more so than just the linebackers. Just like Tommy Reese, we talked a lot about the job that the offensive line coach has done, the receivers coach has done. But you know who else's name we hear a lot with recruits? Tommy Reese, right? And we haven't talked about him, but he's going to be judged on that. We're not going to spend any more time on him because this is focused on the new coaches. But can we start hearing Al Golden's name mentioned the way that we hear Tommy Reese's name? That's going to be a big key. And it's too early yet for that because, again, the season just kind of ended and they're just now getting on the road. But over the next couple months is when we should start hearing that. If he's going to be put in the work on the recruiting trail that he needs to, you're going to start hearing that through May and into June and July. That's going to be the question mark. And that's what he's going to be judged on, in my opinion, Ryan.
No, you're absolutely correct. I would say that, we're going to, I don't want to say temper expectations early, but you're going to tread lightly for a little bit because, for the simple fact is Coach Golden gets on the staff, the last of the new hires, obviously, with the Super Bowl run. He comes in a little bit of a strange time, right? Again, you said it, like right before spring practice starting. So it's not like the most advantageous as far as showing off your recruiting prowess. And then you fall into a situation where, Notre Dame fans know this. The defensive class in 2023 has been higher as far as from a number standpoint comparative to the offensive side of the football. We know this. So for anything, Al Golden needed to come in there. And obviously he needs to make his touches on just the defense in general and what wrinkles and what it's going to look like, what the ideology is going to be. But then you're also, I've talked about it with Al Washington a little bit, coming in and making sure Keon Keeley's solid. He needs to also come in and say, like, this is what defense is going to look like. You still have Coach Freeman in here, who obviously has a huge influence, but like, this is going to be what the defense is going to look like. And this is how you fit into this defense. So there's a lot that was on Coach Golden's plate from just a coaching perspective and just understanding that, like, you need to solidify guys in 2023 that, yes, this is the guy that I also want to come play for. So I think that the transition is just a little different comparative to maybe just a traditional position coach, because there's a lot on his plate in that sense. But I also agree with you in every sense that there are elite linebackers still on the board. And whether Samuel Mpemba ends up as a defensive end long-term, or he's a will linebacker or a Mike, whatever he ends up being, the fact of the matter is right now you recruit him as a linebacker.
Yeah, he's an elite prospect.
Elite athlete.
Right.
Elite athlete.
Right.
Yeah.
And he's right now being recruited for your position.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, so you have an elite athlete in Samuel Mpemba on the board. You have an elite football player in Jay Nosberry. Just fantastic understanding of how to play the linebacker position. He's, of course, is in the Bayou. He's right. He goes to high school on LSU's campus. Getting a player like that would be huge, but I don't want to undersell. And I know we don't talk about him a ton because we're still waiting for him to set up an official visit to Notre Dame. But Darian Gillette is a stud athlete, man. Like really, really talented player.
And more of a natural football player than Mpemba. Or Mpemba's an athlete that is not necessarily a natural football player yet. Gillette is a natural football player without a position yet, without a clearly defined position yet. I mean, the kid had 60-plus catches for over 1,400 receiving yards last year.
Silly. He was a quarterback.
He was like 6'2", 215 at the time. I think you said he's hit a growth spurt since then. He's now up to 6'3", 225. Yeah. I mean, just absurd stuff. So, like, you've got to get one of those guys. Like, you get one of those guys to go with Drake Bowen, who's a top 50 player, right? Mm-hmm. To go with Preston Zenter, who's a top 250 kid. You know, okay, now you're stacking those big time classes on top of each other. And that's what's, again, D-line. That's 2 years in a row you will stack those classes. Because everybody talks about if you put those 23 defensive line with the 22 linebackers, I'm like, hey, y'all, let's not forget what they did on the D-line last year. Josh Burnham is now there. He was a top 100 recruit in high school. Tyson Ford was a top 100 recruit. At least one servicing Rivals had Aiden Goldbyers as a top 100 player. I had him as a top 100 caliber player with 5-star upside. And Donovan Haynes is not a bum that people should be dismissing, right? So it's not like they had some garbage D-line class last year. They had a pretty good D-line class last year. And so you got to stack those things up on top of each other. And at linebacker, to me, getting one of those three guys is the way that you do that. And I would even argue if you get Mpemba, I would still want to push for another because, again, I'm not sold that Mpemba's going to stay at linebacker, in my opinion.
Yeah, but either way, I mean, Mpemba's a big cog because the perception of him, right? Like that is a big piece, especially because I know people keep asking number one class. Well, Samuel Mpemba makes that a lot more achievable from just a perception standpoint. So,
but I would argue too. I mean, you know, I know the 5-star ranking, but like Jaden Nosberry is a top 50 recruit.
Sure.
Darren Gillette isn't there yet, but if these services are smart, he will be. I think On3 actually does have in the top 100 now.
Yeah, I think he's like 60 something. Right. Yeah, he's high now.
But he's going to keep going up, especially if he stays uncommitted for a while, because we know how that being uncommitted tends to have a really good impact on your ability as a football player because it helps you rise up in the rankings for some reason. So, you know, you got to get one of those guys. So it's going to be interesting, Ryan. This staff has really made a great impact so far. So far, so good. Yep. With the early returns on the staff. So I think now it's about, okay, you're ranked number one right now. It's wonderful. Everything is all, you know, sunshine and rainbows and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But it's about no one's going to remember you were ranked number one in June. They're going to remember, okay, where were you ranked in December? Where were you ranked in February? And that's going to require them to close. So midterm report cards, great. Don't slack off in the second half of the semester, right? That's going to be the key. I say that for you, Mr. Former Teacher. You know, you got to really make sure that you can close out the semester well.
Yeah. Progress reports are fun. I miss those days.
Yeah,
as I say very sarcastically.
Incredibly sarcastically, I'm sure. So Ryan, that's going to do it for this section of the show. We're going to dive into our mailbag now, but really good discussion. Lots of great information there, Ryan. I really appreciate all that you brought to the table on that one. We have a couple super chats I wanted to get to here. From Ape Gambino. I think I'm saying that right. It could be, no. If I'm not saying that right, let me know. But hi, guys. Keep up the great work. I was wondering where we stand with Jeremiah Love. Are we still recruiting him as an athlete? Again, thank you so much for the super chat, Ryan. Why don't you go ahead and take a shot at that one?
Yeah, he's an interesting player because obviously the main position is running back, but he's a player that when you've talked to him, he says, hey, I'll play wide receiver, I'll play corner, I'll play safety. He's a very multi-talented player. He also plays defensive back for his school. So, yes, Notre Dame is still recruiting him. I think that it's going to be a question of what do the numbers kind of shake out and how can they fit him into the class. But I do think they would like to have him in the class because this kid is a 6'1", 195-pound, 10-600 meter type of athlete. Like this is a really talented athlete, which I think Notre Dame wants to get in the class. I think ultimately it's going to come down to what do the numbers shake out with defensive backs, for instance, right? Like do they get the 3 safeties and 2 corners? Then is it a little bit of a limited on how many players that you can take as an athlete mold? But I really do think that Notre Dame wants to have Jeremiah Love in this class if they can.
Yeah. It's just going to be the numbers are tight. There's several kids that I know they'd love to have in this class, but it's about, okay, can we make it all work? And that's people say, oh, you just take as many as you can get. It's not that simple. It's not that simple. It's you still have only 85 kids you can have on scholarship, and it makes it a little bit challenging. Anthony K. Shea with a super chat. Thank you very, very, very much for that, Anthony. Hey, IB Nation. Thanks for the content, guys. My babe loves the pink IB hat. Looks good on her, of course. On the course. I assume that's on the golf course. Go Irish. Ryan, you're a babe. Your wife. You're the mother of your child. Don't tell her I called her babe. She has a pink IB hoodie as well. So that you always can find at the merch store. Link to that is below. You can't find this. This was specially made for me, but you can find this. Ryan and I were talking about gear beforehand. I got to send him some more shirts. So I'm going to send you one of the Gap. I got Sean a Gap closers. I didn't realize I'd sent you polos instead of T-shirts. So I got to get you some T-shirts here. That's my bad. Boss isn't stepping up and bringing his merch game well enough. That will get rectified tonight when the show is over. I can assure you of that, buddy. I can assure you of that for sure. So let's get to some more questions here. We're going to Jeff Fluke. I love this one. If we can get your dream class, who is the recruiter of the year? And I would say of the dream class we talked about before, the only player that's not really on the board anymore for that class is Cardinal Tate. Right. And I don't know if I had Jaden Greathouse as part of that before. So, I mean, you just sub out Cardinal Tate for Jaden Greathouse. If that's your dream class, who is the recruiter of the year? I know my answer, Ryan. I'll give mine first. If they get the dream class, because that's Dante Moore, Jaden Lamar, Jaden Greathouse, Rodney Gallagher, Ronan Hannafin, Charles Jagasol, Monroe Freeling, Sullivan Absher, Sam Pendleton. I only had 4 offensive linemen, actually. It's the D-line class now, plus Jason Moore, Jaden Nosberry, or Samuel Mpemba. And it includes getting Christian Gray and Micah Bell at corner or similar type of players. It did not include Caleb Downs because that's not a dream. That's that's a huge upset. I tried to have the dream class be a realistic class. I mean, all those guys are realistic to some degree. I'm still not sold on Caleb Downs being realistic, and I would love to be wrong on that one. But if in that case, I think it's an easy recruiter of the year for me. And with all due respect to Al Washington, who would probably land the most highly ranked guys, for me, it's Chancey Stuckey. Because there's not a position in this class that needed a greater influx of depth, impact talent, and talent that can impact immediately than the receiving core. And to me, if you get that group of Greathouse, Gallagher, and Ronan Hannafin to go with Braylon James, there's at least 2 guys of that group will step in and help right away. And you got 4 legit starting caliber receivers. If that's your foursome with Tobias Merriweather as a 5-man receiver rotation at any point in time in the future, you're throwing on everybody, in my opinion. And it was so needed. So when I go recruit of the year, it's not just, okay, who brought in the highest ranked guys? That will probably be a battle between Heastan and Al Washington, right? Because Monroe Freeling is a top 50 guy. Charles Jagasol's top 50, right? Or you could go with Tommy Reese being, Dante Moore kind of thing. But when I talk about impact talent, so there'd be 3 top 100 players and a 4th guy in Ronan Hannafin, who, with all due respect, film and offer list is that of a top 100 player. At a position where you desperately needed that kind of class, to me, it's Chancey Stuckey, in my opinion.
You stole my answer because I think, again, people would immediately turn to Al Washington if they get Jason Moore, and they'd be like, that's 3 top 50 caliber recruits in one class. But you have to think of it. If he does get Jason Moore, 40% of your class was already in the class when you got there, right? So it's not like he signed.
But you also believe he should get credit for keeping Keon Keeley, which is very true.
I do, but I just think that there's a different perspective when you consider the fact that a guy like a Chancey Stuckey came with a blank board.
Well, let me ask you this, Ryan. Let's just assume that we give Al Golden credit for all 5. Okay? So let's just – not Al Golden, I'm sorry. Al Washington credit for all 5. Okay? Because he kept them in the class, whatever. Just for the – let's use that as the argument. Does it change your answer? And that's kind of my point of that. Does it change your answer?
Yes, it would change my answer. Yeah, it would. It would.
Okay.
Yeah.
You'd give it to Coach Washington.
I give it to Coach Washington for the entirety. I just think it's the fact that one came with a blank slate and one had 2 that was already a part of it, right? But I do want to send a shout out, and a couple people put it in the chat. Chad Bowden needs to be talked
Oh
about.
my gosh,
man. He needs to be talked about. Like we need to say his name because that's a guy.
Because every recruit does.
Exactly. Well, I was about to say, you talk about guys that names keep coming up. Yeah. Chad Bowden's for everyone, every position.
There's only one person whose name gets mentioned more than Chad Bowden's, and that's Marcus Freeman. That is it. That is the end of the list. I mean, Chancey Stuckey gets brought up a lot but offensive linemen, defensive linemen, DBs, receivers, running backs, quarterbacks. It doesn't matter who you talk to. They mention Coach Bowden, right? And I mean, when you've got a guy like that that's able to be a part of the process, it is incredibly important. And you're absolutely right. He'd get like GM of the year, right? Like that would be what the award I would give Chad Bowden. Like who's the GM of the year in college football? It's Chad Bowden, right? And there's no doubt. But when we talk about just coach of the year from a position coach's standpoint, that's where it would be. But yeah, if we're not talking enough about Chad Bowden, and that's on us, because he is doing a phenomenal job with this class. And that helps you so much as a coach, because like, man, I gotta really focus my attention on this player over here, and so I can't maybe I can do that knowing. So like Harry Heastand, but I got to really focus on closing on Monroe Freeling. But you don't want to like put Charles Jagasaw on the back burner because he's an elite musket too. But you're okay saying for the next week, I'm going to really 2 weeks, I'm going to focus on this kid, do a little bit with this kid because I know Chad's hammering that kid, right? So we're not going to fall behind. That is such a great resource for coaches to have. And that was the first hire that Marcus Freeman made. People may not remember this, but one of the things that was a big part of Marcus Freeman's sort of negotiation with Brian Kelly is Chad Bowden's coming with me. Like that was part of that conversation. And so that was the first guy that he brought on. And then of course, last year's defensive class was elite. Chad Bowden was the defensive director of recruiting. Now he's the director of recruiting for the entire operation, and he hasn't missed a beat. And so you're absolutely right. And the people in the chat are absolutely right. He has done a tremendous job with Notre Dame being a part of that. Fort Chinetis is in Notre Dame going after any other tight ends in the 23 class. Ryan, we briefly talked about Deuce Robinson. You did actually speak with Deuce somewhat recently, right? Just kind of
a few weeks ago.
Clear the air with that, just kind of where they are with that.
Yeah, I mean, so Deuce was he's a really nice kid to start out with, right? And, ask him a little bit, what's his conversation with Notre Dame? And, Notre Dame calls him, they keep in contact. But like Brian said, I mean, it was clear after I talked to Deuce, it's just like the damage. I don't want to say damage. We'll say damage. The damage has already been done from just being absent in that recruitment. Like it just is what it is. Deuce is receptive to them, but he doesn't have any plans to return. Like I checked back in with him, still no plans to take an official, get on campus anytime soon. So it's just a pipe dream at this point. But I think Notre Dame would be okay going with just Flanagan in the class. But I think Deuce is the only other player that you can say is even on the board right now, but it's highly unlikely at this point.
Right. It's a good question. John A1 says, if the 23 class finishes like we hope it does, I can't think of a better back-to-back classes in modern era. Which pair of Notre Dame classes is Notre Dame trying to best from the past? I think you'd have to go back to like the 89, 90, 91 stretch is really where you'd have to go. I mean, those were some years where Notre Dame was landing some straight dudes every year. I mean, it was, we talked about this. Notre Dame's 1990 class. This is one of the most absurd things I've ever seen in my life. Their 1990 class landed them 2 NFL Hall of Famers and a third guy who was a college football Hall of Famer.
Is that
the good? 2 NFL Hall of Famers were Bryant Young and Jerome Bettis, which is, pretty decent. And then you also had Aaron Taylor in that class, who is a college football Hall of Famer. That doesn't include Tim Ruddy, who is a multi-year starter, second-round NFL draft pick. Jim Flanagan, fourth-round draft pick. I believe Oliver Gibson got drafted. Pete Bursich spent a lot of years in the NFL. Tom Carter was a first-round draft pick. Jeff Burris was a first-round draft pick. Like, when you can't even get in the top 3 and you were a first-round – like Tim Ruddy, a second-round NFL draft pick and a very, very important player for Notre Dame, is not one of the 5 best guys in that class. I mean, think about that. Lake Dawson was drafted in the NFL. He's not one of the 7 or 8 best players in that class. So like the 4th or 5th round draft pick in the NFL. And you're not one of the 5 or 6 best guys in that class. 6 or 7 best guys in that class. It was just an insane recruiting class. So honestly, we'd have to go back to that era. I mean, you know, when you look at Lou's top 10 that he had, we talked about before. I mean, there was 3 classes kind of from that region. Lou in his top 10 had 86 and 87, both in his top 10. He did not have 89 or 91 in there, but the 90 class was so good that here, I actually have it on my phone, right? I'm going to pull up. Actually, do I not have my phone down here? Yep, it's upstairs with my wife. That's how it always happens, right? The one time I need it during the show, I don't have my phone with me. But I have a list to the roster so I can kind of go through and get the freshman classes. But the 89 and 91 classes also brought in some big-time players because, you know, like Bobby Taylor and guys like that were part of those classes were in there too. But 86 and 87, Lou has both his top 10 classes. The 86 class got Tony Rice. It had Anthony Johnson, Braxton Banks, Tim Grunhard, Dean Brown, Jeff Ulm, Michael Stonebreaker, Pat Terrell, Stanson Mccullough. The 87 class had, did I say Tony Rice? Did I say that in the 86 class? Tony Rice was in the 86 class.
Yep.
The 87 class had Tony Brooks and Ricky Waters. You had Frank Jacobs at tight end. Now, if you ask any of the guys that played tight end or anything, they'll tell you Frank Jacobs was a freak. I think he got hurt or something. Some of the older fans will be able to tell you that. You had Chris Zorich, Mike Helt, Tim Ryan, George Williams, Bob Dahl, Andre Jones, Scott Kolkowski, dude named Todd Light. It's pretty decent, right? Like, you know, but the point is, to your question, John, you'd have to go back to the 89 to 91 era or 86, 87 to find a class that was as good. And not in that list is the 88 class that had Rocket and Derek Brown. You know what I mean? It's some of those guys. So really, that's where you're trying to get back to. You're trying to get back to that era. Kenny Moore, Ryan, actually, John A1 had, before we get to Kenny's, because that was a good question, John A1 had another one that kind of goes to the Coach of the Year aspect, and this is a good one. He says if Notre Dame landed Caleb Downs, because, again, we did not have Caleb Downs as part of that dream class scenario, but if Caleb Downs signs with Notre Dame, would Chris O'Leary then be the recruiter of the year?
Yes.
Yeah.
In my opinion,
he'd pull off the biggest upset of all of them.
Biggest upset, and that goes on top of having Peyton Bowen in the class already as a top 50 caliber player and having Adon Schuler, who everyone underrates, but is a top 150 type of player.
By the way, Adon Schuler got offered by Georgia today.
So he's pretty good. He's pretty good.
He's been offered by Georgia and Alabama since he committed to Notre Dame. It's pretty decent, right? Yeah. That's your third guy. I don't know if I could. I mean, I have to think about that one more, John, because, again, I look at the need factor too. But if we're just talking who got the best players, I mean, you're talking about two top 50 guys, including one 5-star at a position where you only need 2 starters. That's what we're talking about Al Washington doing with a position that has 4 starters, right? So, yeah, he'd be in that conversation. He'd no question be in that conversation. And I would call safety a need. So I think that adds into it as well. It is a big need. I mean, all the positions are need, but it's the degree of it. And safety was near the top of the board this year. Safety and receiver and corner were those 3 spots. And I'd even say safety more than corner because, you know, Mike Mickens has had 2 pretty darn good corner classes in a row. It's not like Notre Dame lacks for talent at corner. They just need the next level of talent. Safety, there's a need at safety. Like, you had a legitimate need. Like, you're going to be running out of dudes here real quickly. You just lost Kyle Hamilton. In the next 2 years, maybe in the next year, you're not going to have Brandon Joseph, DJ Brown, or Houston Griffith. And, you know, now you're really getting thin. So, yeah, John, I think that's a great question. If they get Caleb Downs, assuming that Chris O'Leary was the main driver of that, then, yeah, I mean, he's in that conversation because that's part of it too. It's not just about what position. It could be a situation where, you know, maybe it was Marcus Freeman and Al Golden that were the drivers or something. You know, we just have to, you know, do some more homework. We don't really know because Caleb doesn't talk to anybody. But yeah, that'd be an interesting one, John. That's a great question. I love that one. Kenny Moore, speaking of that, Kenny Moore says corner recruiting is a major concern at the moment. For the 2023 class, Kenny, it'd be hard for me to say that you're wrong. Here's the thing, though, Ryan. 2 things I like. Number 1, there's some really talented players on the board. And number 2, this staff is not sitting back and hoping that they get guys. They have thrown out another offer today of a kid that you really like, and they threw another corner offer out the other day. But this is a kid I know that you like a lot. The kid that they offered today, Josiah, what's his last? Wagner, Josiah Wagner from Washington, top 150 kid. I know you had a chance to watch this film, Ryan. I have not. What'd you think of Josiah?
Yeah, Josiah. I was really pleasantly surprised by Josiah, to be honest. I thought, and maybe it's kind of the Washington ties. He's obviously from the state of Washington. He reminded me a lot of Byron Murphy, though, that played at the University of Washington, is now with the Arizona Cardinals. He was a second-round draft pick. Really not the longest guy of all time, but really from an off-man zone perspective, just really intelligent, really good click and close. I think he could play a little bit inside and out. So I liked his film a lot, to be honest with you. So but Kenny, to your point, it is definitely a concern. I mean, I know we've been speaking rainbows, throughout this podcast as far as how well this staff is doing, but I mean, cornerback recruiting is a big question mark in 2023. You lost Justin Rhett. You don't have anybody on the board right now that's committed. You have guys that are talented like Micah Bell, Micah Tease, Christian Gray. Like, they're talented players, but none of them are in the class right now, right? Like it's and I don't know, is Notre Dame the lead? I think that they are in the running for a couple of those guys as far as being near the top, but are they the clear leader for anyone?
Yeah, they're in the top 3 for all of them.
Sure.
The only one that I would go out on a limb and say that they're the leader for is Micah Bell. I know you like where they stand with Micah Tease. I have some doubts. Neither of us think that they're the leader for Christian Gray. So to your point, yeah, you've got to close on some of those guys, but you also you just can't sit back and hope you land those guys. And that's what I like about the offer today. Here's an interesting note about Josiah Wagner as well. He has an offer from Yale. So he's going to fit that profile. Right. Yep. And it's amazing, all these 4.0 students that are all of a sudden interested in Notre Dame. Like, it just so happened this year. Like, Tyler Williams is a 4.0 student. Did you see the letter he put in the local paper to his mom? Go look at his Twitter page and read that. Like, he's the kid that Marcus Freeman said, there's other kids that are Notre Dame kids. They just don't know it yet. We got to convince them of it. They need to get him on campus. Because I'll say this, if Tyler Williams visits Notre Dame, here's my bold prediction. If he visits Notre Dame for an official visit, he will sign with Notre Dame. That's my bold prediction. Because he is him and Braylon James are almost the same kid from a profile standpoint. 4.0 student from a public school in Florida, right? Very intelligent. Like I said, wrote a letter to his mom for Mother's Day that was published in the local paper. You don't have to read it. Very, very impressive young man. He's one of those Florida kids that doesn't realize that Notre Dame is the place for him yet, and he may never. But if they get him on campus, I think that's my bold prediction. They're going to sign him. But right now, I don't predict. That's a less bold prediction than me predicting he's going to visit campus. Like, that would be going out on more of a limb than saying they'll get him if he does visit. But that, to me, corner's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting. But I do like the fact that they're putting in the work. And Micah Bell getting on campus this summer is going to be the big one. They just need somebody to kind of get that ball rolling. That's going to be the key. Jeff Fluke says, with the front 7 that we have, plus the safeties, do we need top-of-line corners, or could we go mid-tier until we put some in the league? I don't think you should ever settle for that. Because if you go mid-tier, I think that's a regression from what you've done the last 2 years. I don't think the 2021 class more so than 2022, because there's some projects in that class. But I love Ryan Barnes. But last year's corner class with Benjamin Morrison and Jade Mickey, that's not mid-tier. So, no, I don't expect them to go mid-tier. You just need to get the guys you have. If they let's just say they get Micah Bell and Josiah Wagner, right? Ryan, you've seen Josiah Wagner. I haven't. So I'm going to ask you this. Is that mid-tier, or is that it's not going to be on the level of other positions, but would you call that mid-tier? Would you say that's a pretty good – he's a top 150 football player. Micah Bell's a top 150 football player.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not mid-tier. And if that's the class they get, I'd be completely okay with it, because I kind of view them very differently. I think Josiah is kind of a more ready-made type of player, can maybe play year one a little bit. Maybe the upside isn't quite as high as a Micah Bell, but yeah, it's definitely not mid-tier. You answered your question, because it's 2 top 150 kids, and they're 150 caliber. Like, it's not just that they're a little overrated. Like, they're good football players, and Micah Bell is a incredibly talented athlete, so his upside is high.
Tyler asks, 1 to 10 confidence level for the number 1 class in 2023. I'm at an 8. The staff is crushing it. Where are you at on that one, Ryan?
I'm about the same as Tyler. I'd say I'm an 8. I have now passed the cautiously optimistic to now I think it's a very tangible thing at this point. So I think I'd say an 8 as well. Not quite there, but I'm feeling good. I'm feeling
I'm at a
pretty good.
7. I'm at a
Okay.
7 because number one, I need to see one more elite player commit first, because they're not going to be a top number one class with 1 5-star. And, I need to see Dante, join the class. I need to see a Caleb Downs. I need to see that. And then I need to see a couple other top 50 guys join first. Like I think they're on their way, but it's kind of like how I felt when I gave my confidence levels for recruits the other day, right? Like, Charles Jagasaw, I gave a 7. I think they lead. I think they're the team to beat. I feel confident in it, but there's still enough questions out there that I'm not ready to go full 8-9 yet. And that's how I feel about this class. They're on their way. I think this class has a chance. It's not one of those deals where they have to bat 1,000 across the board. They don't. There's a couple positions, though, they have to bat 1,000, right? Like they have to get Dante Moore. They have to get Jason Moore. They have to get one of those linebackers that we talked about, right? And then receiver to me is if you give me of Dante Moore, Jaden Greathouse, Rodney Gallagher, Monroe Freeling, Charles Jagasaw, Jason Moore, Jaden Nosberry, Darren Gillette, Sam Mpemba, and Caleb Downs. Those 10 players, those are big-time players. That's the group that's going to determine if Notre Dame's going to be the top class or not. Hitting the more of those guys you get, the better chance you have in having number one class. They got to get at least 2 or 3 of those guys, or I'd say 4 or 5 of those guys for me to really up my confidence level. And so when there's that many guys still on the board, I'm not quite there yet, but I'm certainly close. Now I'll say this, I have never been an 8. So this isn't my confidence level going down. We've never been asked this question. My confidence level at 7 is as high as it's ever been. So I don't want people to think like it's down from I used to be a 9 and now I'm down. So I don't want people read into that. Driscoll said it's a 7. He must not think they're going to get Dante Moore or somebody else, right? That's not. It's always been a 7 until
Right.
more. I mean, now getting Devin Houston adds only more confidence to that 7. But I just need to see a couple more of those. Like Sullivan Absher is a great pickup, but that doesn't move the needle for me to number one class because again, we're talking about recruiting rankings, right? Mm-hmm. And so I just need to see a few more of those guys before I'm ready to go there, Brian.
That's fair. I just love that we can have the conversation. I remember when we first did the show on if it's a realistic thing, it was just kind of like, seems like a little bit of a pipe dream, like it's hopeful, but seems a lot more tangible now. It seems possible, which is
some of the things that have helped too is, when we first had that conversation, I was like, well, I don't know if Keon Keeley's going to necessarily stick. He's taking visits and all that kind of stuff. Can they get any top receivers? Well, they've already taken steps to those things, right? I mean, they've already gotten Boubacar and they've already gotten Braylon James, and Keon is locked into the class. And so, they've weathered the storm on Peyton Bowen, those kind of things. Because at the time, Ryan, we're not only talking about Notre Dame needing to get guys, but they got to keep the guys they have. And I think there's more confidence that they're going to do that now. That's probably where my confidence level has raised the most, is that I think they're going to keep the guys that they have more so than I thought before. Bobby Halfacre says, hey, Brian, I know we need another quarterback, but full faith in Tyler Buckner. Where do you think we stand with at least another top-notch receiver? Ryan, we kind of talked about that earlier, but just kind of where would you rank your confidence level of the 3 receivers that we discussed earlier? So let's go Jaden Greathouse, Rodney Gallagher, Ronan Hannafin. How would you rank your confidence level first to third, number 1 being most confident, third being least confident of those 3 players at this point in time?
Yeah, right now I'd say Jaden Greathouse is my most confident level. After that, it's kind of splitting hairs with Rodney Gallagher and Ronan Hannafin, which sounds silly now, again, kind of based upon what we've been in the past, but I really think that Notre Dame made a huge impact on Rodney Gallagher in their last visit. I think getting him back on campus and for that June 10th weekend is going to be a huge, huge opportunity to, I think, really vault yourself, not from the favorite, but like put some distance between you. Like, I think that's the opportunity there. So I think that they are the slim leader for Rodney Gallagher right now, but you need to close. I don't think that this is a foregone conclusion. And then Ronan Hannafin is just a weird one, man. Like I still maybe would say that they're the leader for Ronan Hannafin, but the attention is just picked up so much that I am just not as confident as I was before. I think he could still very much end up in Notre Dame's class, but I think it's going to be a dogfight for him in this class. So I probably go Greathouse, Gallagher, Hannafin right now, which is weird to think about.
Yeah, 2 months ago it would have been Hannafin, Greathouse, Gallagher for me.
Right.
Yeah, no doubt. Benjamin Carchi, what is a conversation like with a kid that is committed already? Is it a, hey, how are you? We need your help with something. Keep up the great work. That's part of it, but that's a small part of it. It's really just about, you think about any relationship that you're trying to build, whether it be with a friend or someone you work with, you're trying to start. I mean, beyond just a coworker, hey, how are you? But someone you're really trying to establish a real, genuine relationship with, right? It's getting to know more about the person. It's, finding out who they are, what makes them tick. It's if you really want to keep a guy, it's that, hey man, hey, how was that finals test you had on Thursday? Right? Like, oh man, that's great. Congratulations. So what's next on the plate for you? And not just doing it to pass time, but doing it because you genuinely care. Man, coach, I'm really struggling with this class. He goes, okay, well, have you talked to your teacher? You talked to professor, and just really becoming like that big brother, father figure, whatever the kid needs kind of thing, but it's got to be genuine. It's that kind of stuff. And then of course, going over particulars. Hey, how are you on your, signing up for your courses next month? Cause you got to make sure you're doing this, and this to make sure you're on pace to graduate and clear through admissions, making sure kids are keeping their GPAs up, make sure kids are passing the classes they need to pass, make sure kids are putting in the workouts, scheduling visits. I mean, there's a lot of that stuff too, but that's all part of that building that relationship. So it goes much deeper than that. And of course you'll ask, hey, give so-and-so a call and all that, but it's really just about establish that relationship. So when that kid gets to your campus, you've already there's already that trust. You don't then got to work on building your trust with him on the practice field. That's there. Now it's about, let's get this kid ready to go. And I think that's what the good coaches do. Is it's building that genuine, deep relationship where you truly know them, the family. There's a trust there on both sides, because it's not just about that kid learning to trust you. You got to learn to trust him as well. And I think that's a big part of it. John A. says, how many position groups can Notre Dame haul in as arguably the best in 2023? So we're talking about the best position groups in the country. Ryan, that's an interesting one. So I'm going to give my answer in based on how I view kids, how I rank kids, not what other kids are ranked. So for me, the positions are, and I'll kind of list mine. You tell me if you agree or disagree, and then you can give others that I don't mention. Yep. I'd say quarterback is one, because I believe that Dante Moore is the best quarterback in the country. So if you land the best quarterback in the country, in my opinion, you have the best quarterback situation. That's just my opinion. Wide receiver, I think they have a shot to do that. I'm not as confident there, because none of those guys are guaranteed to be top 50 guys. They could all be top 100 guys, but none of them are right now top 50 guys. And I think you need a top 50 guy or two to really be number one, but they have a shot there at least. O-line, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
D-line, safety, and linebacker. You're going to be hard-pressed to have a better linebacking core than Notre Dame if they get Nosberry and or Impemba with Drake Bowen. You're going to be hard-pressed to beat that. You're talking about two top 50 kids, plus Preston Zinter, who's a 4-star kid, assuming guys don't get dropped. But again, I'm looking at it from how I view kids. And Preston Zinter is a top 250 kid for me. So to me, that's 6 position groups. Would you argue that anyone else should be on there? Not running back, not tight end, not corners, and that's it, right? So who do we leave? We left running backs out, we left tight ends out, and we left corners out, right?
That's it. Yep.
So 6 to have a shot at. Thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, if the safety position is able to get Caleb Downs in this reality, right? Like, that's number one. That's going to be the top safety group. I think that you still have an argument even if you don't, because again, you have a top 50 kid and you have a kid that Inadon Schuler is a top 125, 150 type of player. So it's still a really good class. But I think the number one class that you has every argument is defensive line, especially if you get Jason Moore. Like, you have a legitimate argument there. If you get a Jaden Nosberry or a Samuel Impemba or both at the linebacker spot, then you have another argument for linebacker as well. And then I think offensive line is the other one that if you sign everybody that we've talked about, especially where I mean, Charles Jagasaw is viewed as a top 10 player by who is it on 3, right? So he's very highly thought
7th,
about.
I think, last I saw.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
Monroe Freeling is in the 30s for them.
Right.
And they have Absher 99.
So you're talking three top 100 players, 2 guys top 40 players, 1 in the top 10 players. So if you sign that class, then you got an opportunity too. Quarterback's an interesting one. It's a really interesting one because I think that's just at that point it's subjective, right? Because it's not going to be about depth of quarterback. It's going to be who you just value the most. Right. But
I would say is the best guy and the best fit and the best fit.
Exactly.
So it'll either be USC with Malachi. Some will think it's them. Some will think it's Arch wherever he goes, which right now people thinking it's Texas because Alabama's now making a push for the Eli Holstein kid because, people realize that they're not going to get Arch. Then it's does he go to Georgia or Texas, right? That's the question with Arch. Or it's going to be Tennessee with Nico. Now, to me, Nico is in a whole different category than those 3 kids. I've said this before. He's not in. I would rather hear an argument for Jaden Rashada than I would hear for one from Nico in regards to top who should be ranked next in the quarterback class. And the kid from Louisiana, Holstein, that was committed to A&M is now looking to go to Bama. He's in that conversation too. I would take him personally over Nico, but it's just about who you think is the best. And so wherever Arch goes is where who people are going to say is number 1 because that's who everybody has as the number 1 quarterback in the class. SI All-American, I'm pretty sure won't because I'll be part of that process and he's not my number 1 guy. But others will say it's Malachi. For me, I've said this from day one. Dante Moore's the best quarterback in this class, in my opinion. As of right now, he's the best quarterback in this class. So that would be one. Any others that you say, yeah, I think receiver, it'd be the one I would have the least confidence in because, again, it's hard to have the best class and you don't have anybody in the top 50 in your class. Now, again, that's a great receiving class. I'm thrilled with it. I think some of those guys are a tad underrated, but again, there's also a ton of receivers in the country.
Sure.
And so, there's going to be people that have a shot to be better than that. Some people may have a couple top 50 guys, but who's going to have 4 top 100 guys? I mean, it's like, how do you evaluate it? But that's the one I'm least confident in my opinion, Ryan. Safety's only if they get Caleb Downs. I mean, so
right.
I don't have a lot of confidence in that because I don't think they're going to get Caleb Downs. Now, even if they don't get Caleb Downs, I have a hard time seeing more than 5 or 6 teams have a better safety tandem than the one that they have right now. Right? I mean, that's the other piece to it. Right. And then, offensive line, you talked about defensive line. If they get Jason Moore, I don't see how anybody surpasses them unless like all the top 50 kids go to one school. That's about the only way I could see it.
Right.
So that's my answer. Really, really good question, John. I really dig that one. Irish Nick, does it concern you guys that Rodney Gallagher has more official visits scheduled after the Irish on June 10th? I like it when we're last. I like it when it's last 2, but it's not a thing that is really a concern unless the kid is like 50-50.
Right.
And I think by the time like Rodney Gallagher gets there, the other thing too is I don't think the school that had the best shot to beat Notre Dame as of today is after them. I don't believe because I believe that West Virginia is before, correct? Or am I wrong on that? Let me go look at that.
I think they're before.
I could be wrong on that. Let me just go make sure.
Well, I'll say
so he's going to West Virginia June 3rd to 5th. And I'll say right now, and I've said this for a while, I've never felt like Penn State was the threat that people made him out to be. West Virginia and Pitt are the 2 teams that I have been most concerned about. Mm-hmm. And Pitt's he's not making an official to Pitt right now.
Yeah.
And they went through a coaching staff change at receiver. West Virginia, they're like 25 minutes from his house. I mean, they're like really close. That's his backyard school. It's West Virginia, not Pitt. And so I'm actually a little bit more concerned about them than I am Penn State. That's just I could be wrong on that, but that's my read on the situation. So I don't view Oklahoma State as a concern. Like that's not I don't see that one happening. If he was going to still play basketball, I'd be nervous about that one. But he's a football player.
Yeah, I don't buy into the Penn State thing as much as people talk about either. I mean, he had a visit right after the Notre Dame visit this past spring as well to Penn State, and after talking to him about the Penn State visit, I don't think that one moved the needle at all. So, I mean, it could be something where he just has a recurring relationship where like maybe it shouldn't move the needle quite as much because it's not his first time seeing it. But I'm just not buying it. I again, like Brian said, I am on the same wavelength in the sense that I also like when they have the last visit because that's the last pitch, right? Like you're the final person to put your chips in the middle of the pot. But I really do think that I don't think it's going to be determined by who is going to go last with Rodney Gallagher. I think he's a thoughtful kid. I think he's going to make a good decision. I don't think it's going to be impulsive. I think he's going to take some time afterwards to make a good decision for himself.
Agree. I think if he was going to be that kind of emotional kid, I think he would have made a decision already. I think he would have fallen in love with one of the schools during an unofficial and would have popped. So I agree with you. Tom Malork said, let me say this. I think that's where him being a basketball recruit helps. So you ever notice basketball players rarely make early decisions like that when they're top kids? So I wonder how much that helps him as well. But that's a good question, Nick. I like that. Tom Malork says, Coach D, what would you say would be the number one thing Tobias should work on before he reports? Route running, reading coverages, working versus press, or something else? Thanks. Tommy B. Tommy, I'd say weight room. I mean, honestly, Tobias is a pretty advanced kid. Now, look, he's going to have to work on his route running. He's going to have to work on reading coverages. That right there is probably the biggest one from a skill, like a receiver skill standpoint, right? Because I don't care who you play in high school, you're not facing the coverages you're schematically that you're facing in college. You're just not. I don't care if you're playing IMG schedule, modern day schedule, don't care. So that'll be the biggest adjustment. He's a pretty good route runner, Ryan. He's a very advanced kid. He's pretty good against the press for a high school kid. He's got a really good feel for the game. He's a smart football player. I'd say that's going to be the biggest one. But the biggest thing for me that's going to determine whether he plays a lot or it's just an occasional Kevin Austin type of role player isn't necessarily one of those, although those are all important. It's the weight room. Is he strong enough to hold up? Because he's a skinny kid. If he really attacks the weight room, Tobias Merriweather is going to be really hard to keep off the field. He really is, in my opinion.
Yeah, because I mean, what'd you say? He's like what 6'3", 6'4",
he's
like
at least
185.
6'3", yeah. He's
right
listed
now.
at 6'4", yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty that's a pretty consistent thing across the board. Usually guys, especially wide receivers, like they're usually skinnier guys in high school, right? So that's a big thing, especially for a guy that length that you would envision down the road to be a guy that can win vertically a little bit and win at the catch point and do those types of things. So yeah, I would agree. I think from a nuanced perspective, he's pretty advanced for his age. It's going to be about the physical side of the coin.
Next question from Matt Ginter. Matt's trying to really get us here. Ginter, how do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10 for Southern Absher?
I would we'll say a 9.
Let's just say this.
I guess. I mean,
we'll never say 10 for a kid unless he's committed, right? So that's just the reality of it. But yes, 9. Yes.
I'll say a 9. Yes. Feel very good. Very good.
Yep. Anthony Solomon. I believe they can get to number 1 if the rankings stay the same, but we all know that it's possible they change the rankings to fit a narrative. And you're absolutely right. And that's why at the end of the day, I'm going to be consistent. I don't care about what the recruiting services say. Like right now, Rivals has Texas Tech ahead of Notre Dame. That's absurd. That's just stupid. On 3 has Alabama as the number 1 class in the country. Alabama, I have like 4 kids in the class. They're the number 1 class in the country because however stupid ranking they come up with. So it's like, I don't care about that. I care about us being able to subjectively look at these rankings and say that class is better than that class. I care more about that. Now, I care about being ranked number 1 from a perception standpoint because I'm not going to dismiss the fact that being ranked number 1 or 2 in that conversation will help you recruit further players because they care about stuff like that. I don't, right? And, with all due respect, Texas A&M had the number 1 ranked recruiting class last year. There's a couple other classes I would consider trading that class for. I just would because it's more about, can you put a team together, right? And so that's what I care more about, Anthony. But to your point, that's also why another reason why I don't care about rankings, because they can easily be manipulated for things that have nothing to do with who's the better players. And we know that they are. Like if Notre Dame wants to be ranked number 1 in the ESPN recruiting rankings, there's a real simple thing. Tell all your kids to go play in the Under Armour game. You have number 1 ranked class. Simple as that. Zach Martin, who is the most surprising get thus far in Freeman's classes, 22 or 23? It's a good question. So defense last year, and then the whole thing this year. For me, it's probably Jalen Sneed. And the reason I say that is like once they got on him, it was clear they were going to get him. But when they first offered him, I was like, they got no shot getting that kid. No shot. Like he's from South Carolina. He's got all these SEC offers. Like there's no way they're going to get that kid. That's not the kind of kid. Public school kid. There's no way they're going to get Jalen Sneed. Now I didn't know the background with his coach being tight with Marcus Freeman. I didn't know any of that stuff. But that would probably be the one for me from last year's class.
What was the perception of Benjamin Morrison with Notre Dame early on? Were they always in the
once they got involved, they were considered one of the top teams. Yeah. Now there was some back and forth there, and the Michigan people thought they were going to get him because they think they're going to get everyone, and they never do. And and then the way that one played out, so he actually was leading to Notre Dame for a while. And was looking like he was going to pick Notre Dame for a while. And then Washington made a hard push. And there was a lot of people kind of talking about how, Washington may be the team to beat. And then, they may be able to pull an upset. And, Jimmy Lake has always beaten Notre Dame for guys. And now Alabama got involved. But they were considered a strong contender for him for a while. As soon as they got involved. I'd say like Jaden Mickey, same way. Junior Tuihalamaka, Notre Dame offering him is one of the reasons he decommitted from USC. I mean, you know what I mean? So, I'd say maybe Tyson Ford kind of flipped quickly. He was kind of winding down. That might be one. Oklahoma looked like they were going to get him, and then Marcus Freeman gets involved and they get him. This year's class, I'd say, who would you say would be the biggest surprise for you so far in this year's class? Keon Keeley's not for me. He's a Notre Dame kid. And when they got on him, he was not even a top 100 kid when they got him to commit, which is absurd. But I'd say for me, Ryan, it's probably Peyton Bowen. It's probably my
really think so.
Yeah,
I think my biggest one just from when I started was Braylon James. Probably, I know he fits right. Like high academic kid. He wants to be away from home. Like he fits a lot of what makes sense why he would end up at Notre Dame. But I just remember first kind of digging into that recruitment a little bit. I just thought he was going to go to Texas, to be honest. Like I just didn't see Notre Dame at first. And then obviously things went a different direction. So
Michael Johnson says, Brian and Ryan, where does this D-line class rank in Notre Dame history? It's not there yet to be talked about in history yet, right? Like for me, right now it's more of is this one of the best of the last 10 to 15 years? It's in that conversation now. They got to get Jason Moore before I'm ready to start talking about where does it stack up against other elite classes. But, right now, Michael, when I talk about history, for me, I can only really compare it to the Rivals era, so to speak, the recruiting services era, which began in 2002. If they get Jason Moore, and we've said this before, it's the best class to me. Now, the 11 class had more elite top 30 5-star kind of guys, right? They had Ishak, Tuitt, and Lynch were all top 30 guys. But after that, there's a bit of a drop-off. You had Tony Springmans and Anthony Rabasas and Chase Hounshells and Tony Springmans and those kind of guys, right? So there was like the big three and then drop-off. Where this group is, your fourth guy, if they get Jason Moore, is Boubacar, who's a top 100 recruit. Your fifth guy is Devin Houston, who's a top 200 recruit. So it's like Devin versus Tony Springman and Boubacar versus Chase Hounsell is a way bigger gap than Aaron Lynch and Keon or, Brennan Vernon and Stephon Tuitt as recruits, or Jason Moore and Ishak, right? Or probably a better comparison would be, Keon versus Lynch, right? Those are both the number ones. And then it's Jason Moore versus Tuitt. And then it's Brennan versus Ishak, right? Like, Ishak was a higher ranked recruit than Brennan, but it's not by a ton. Stephon right now is a higher ranked recruit than Jason Moore is, but it's not by a ton. Keon is ranked higher than Aaron was, right? But they're all close. But 4-5, it's a blowout for this current class, and that's the difference. And even you look at the 2016 class, Ryan, which had Dalen Hayes, who's a 5-star, right? And by one service, he was outside the top 100 by others. Julian Aguar is a really good, had a lot of upside, but he was a top 200 kid. Scout had him a top 200. Khalid Kareem was a top 200 kind of guy. They flipped from Bama. And then Adi. It's not even close from a recruiting ranking standpoint. Now, I think that class was better than it got ranked because I like the Adi Tagumba Ogundiji. Loved his upside. I gave him a 4.5-star upside grade. I think he, kind of played into that, in my opinion. Julian Aguara, 3rd-round pick. Khalid Kareem was a 5th-round pick despite missing the whole offseason going into the draft with a shoulder injury. Yep. If it's not for the shoulder injury, Khalid's going higher, 4th or 3rd round most likely, So And then Adi was drafted. Daylon, I mean, all 4 of those guys got drafted. But with all due respect, the number 1, 2, and 3 players in that draft in that class or in this class are better than the 1, 2, and 3 players in that class. And then 4 and 5 is not close. With all due respect to Adi, who I love, he's not the prospect Boubacar is. Floor or ceiling, in my opinion. So, yeah, this class right now is in the conversation with 2011. If they get Jason Moore, it's no longer a conversation. I can't really compare it to the 1990 class, for example, because I only know of the Bryant Young who became a Hall of Famer. I don't know what he was as a high school prospect. I don't know enough about where guys were as high school players to go back and say, yeah, they stack up against this group. I couldn't possibly compare it to I think it was like Lou had talked about this. Like, I think and some of y'all will know better than me, but I think the 73 class had Willie Fry and Ross Browner, and I think that's absurd. But I have no clue what those guys were as high school players. They could have been not highly recruited and broke out in college for all I care, or they could have been parade All-Americans that were big time recruits. I don't know. Mm-hmm. So I can really only go with modern history to answer your question, Michael. But they have to get one more, in my opinion, for us to really have that conversation. No doubt, this is the best D-line class Notre Dame's had in 30 years, in my opinion. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, obviously I just remember that Aaron Lynch class just, from being a fan, and it was incredible. Just, what would be fun though? I think I might do this. I'm running it past you right now.
Story as we're idea. Live. You're gonna make me say no in front of all these people? Come on, man.
I would love going back and you did the Aaron Lynch versus Keon Keeley debate, right? I would love to go back and look at some Aaron Lynch high school highlights and compare the two.
Very similar
ballpark,
Very similar. Keon was more advanced as a junior. Aaron was a monster as a senior. Monster. He was unbelievable. And what he did at the Army All-American game was just absurd. I felt bad for those. It was like that all week. He beat up the East offensive lineman all week in practice and then had 3 sacks in the game. It was absurd. It was absurd. It was you got to be kidding me. And Stephon played really well that week, but nobody talked about it because of how good Aaron was. Plus, there was all the drama around Aaron. He was committed to Florida State. And I wish I could tell you all the backstory and because I was a part of that whole thing. It was wild. But he shows up. And his mom told me this was going to happen. She said, just so you know, when Aaron lands, there's going to be some craziness. I'm like, okay, why? He's wearing his Notre Dame shorts or sweats or something. I'm like, oh, God, here we go. So and it was all week. And then, of course, he meets in the hotel room with the Notre Dame staff, and then he meets with the Florida State staff. He comes walking down into the elevator of the hotel going like this, right? And just the whole drama. And the thing that really helped Notre Dame out, and I'll just share this is the only tidbit I'll share. Florida State flinched. Because what happened is Florida State tried to do some some behind the scenes stuff to try to get Aaron from San Antonio to Tallahassee and not let him go home. Because they thought if he went home, he was eventually going to, all that. And they started trying to change his flights without telling him and his mom and all this other kind of stuff. And when they did that, they kind of burned that bridge. And that's what actually one of the things that sent Aaron to Notre Dame. That and his relationship with Tony Alford, which was real strong. But if Florida State would have just called the flip down, let it play out, they probably still got Aaron Lynch. But they started doing things that caused Aaron to say, forget you, I'm going over here. And then when Greg Hudson was trying to tell him, you can't succeed there academically, that was one of the things too that sent him over the edge. But yeah, Florida State screwed that one up big time. But that made for a very interesting week at the Army game, Ryan. And you don't see that a lot anymore, not for Notre Dame, because most of these kids are already signed by then. You know what I mean? So timeout, Tom. You keep asking this in the chats, man. And we talked about this a couple shows ago when you asked it last time. It was a great question, but you said if Notre Dame gets Gallagher, Greathouse, and Hanfin, could they be Pied Pipers, Dante Moore? And yeah, I think the answer is yeah. And we went into more detail. What was it, last Wednesday or Thursday or Friday, Ryan?
Something like that.
I think it was. Yep. We talked about it, Tom. I'd encourage you to go check it out. But I think you're onto something. I hadn't really ever thought about that a whole lot. But yeah, I think you're onto something. I think they could be. It doesn't hurt, right? It doesn't hurt. I'll say that.
Agree.
Matthew Hader says, I'd love to see Coach Washington go hard after Justin Scott, even though we just offered. I'm hearing pretty much all positive. Can he get him in the pipeline? Well, they're trying.
Yes.
Right. And Sean Davis and us and you and I have talked about this. Notre Dame's got if they push, they have a really good shot with him. Because what you got to understand about Justin is he goes to St. Ignatius, a really good private school. And from what little we've learned about him and his mother, I mean, it screams Notre Dame kid, which is why I think they waited so long to offer him, because they needed to make sure that he was a guy they wanted or had room for or fit or whatever. Because when you offer him, there's a chance it may go quickly. Now, it may not, but there's the chance.
Sure.
And so, yes, if they push for him, I think they have a really good shot with him. And I see no reason why they shouldn't push for him. And I mean, honestly, he should have been offered already, if we're being honest. Right. But maybe they were trying to build up suspense or whatever. I have no idea. I don't care. The offer's there now. He needs to be like A-list priority, because if you can add him and Brandon Davis Swain in the class after what you just got, I mean, can you imagine an interior rotation in a couple years of Devin Houston, Jason Moore, Brendan Vernon, Justin Scott, and I mean,
I have to tell you, he was one of the more interesting films I've watched too, Brian. I don't know if you felt the same way about this, but like I had a preconceived notion, right? Which happens sometimes. It's like 6'5", 310.
Let me guess.
Nose.
Big, strong, can't move.
And it was the absolute opposite. I was like, oh, my boy's making some plays in pursuit now. Yeah. Oh, he can move a little bit.
He is athletic he doesn't look 310. I mean,
no, he doesn't.
I don't think he is 310, to be honest with you. But if he
probably
is
290,
he is, he's going to be 325 when it's all said and done, because he has a athletic looking frame. Like, that's the thing that surprised me. His picture surprised me even more than the film. He's like, that kid doesn't look like what I thought a sophomore 310 pounder is going to look like. He's put together.
I thought he was going to be sloppy. Right,
yes, he's not. Now he's not like defined and like chiseled like Keon. He's a sophomore.
Right.
But he's just got, it's like all good. He's just big. He looks a lot like Stephon Tuitt did as that age too, where he's even thicker than Stephon was. But Stephon was always just big. This kid's just big. And boy, he's impressive looking. And he can move. I mean, that's the thing. Like you said, that's the thing. He makes a lot of plays in the backfield. Yes, and it's not just because of his power. It's because he's beating you off the line athletically. That's the thing that shocked me. I was like, wow, this kid, and that was my first thought. How did this kid not already have an offer? Like, prime A recruit.
And he's got the recruiting background too. I mean, he's the number 3 player in the country by either 247 or 3. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yep. No doubt. We have JP Buellsfeld. Thank you, JP. Are we recruiting Avery Johnson? His high school in Mays, Kansas, about 30 minutes from my home. So curious. As of right now, no. They are still on the Dante Moore train. I do know that Notre Dame likes Avery a lot. There's a couple other quarterbacks that I think they would turn to. Avery would be one of them if they miss on Dante, but as of right now, their focus is on Dante Moore. And speaking of, we are not Marshall. If Notre Dame lands Dante Moore, does he start year 1? Barring injury, no. I mean, again, Tyler Buckner's a really good quarterback. Tyler Buckner would have been a 5-star on my board if he didn't miss a senior year. Yeah, there's no doubt. If he would have done anything close at Helix to what he did, like, I mean, if he'd have thrown for 3,000 plus and 1,000 as a rusher at Helix, which is possible because he upped the competition, he would have been a 5-star recruit to me. I mean, he had the tools. But so no, Dante Moore's not going to just come in and be like, sit down, Tyler. But if Tyler gets hurt again, then like you can't miss half the spring if Dante Moore's there. You just can't, because you may not get that job back.
Right.
But as long as Tyler's healthy, they're starting quarterback for at least the next 2 years, in my opinion. I think it's good for Dante because Dante needs time. Dante is, I mean, look, if Bryce Young needed to sit a year, Dante Moore can sit a year. Okay, like he'll be fine. Can I name the quarterbacks in the last few years that like basically sat out as freshmen? I mean, it begins with Jameis Winston and ends with Bryce Young. There's that Joe Burrow guy in the mix there, Justin Fields. I mean, there's some pretty good quarterbacks that didn't do anything as freshmen other than mop up duty, or in Justin Fields' case, punt safe in the SEC title game against Alabama because their coach is an idiot.
Oh my God.
Brian Seaver. If BK were still the head coach, would LZ be in the class already? Yes.
Probably. Yep.
No question. Tommy Guns, because Del Alexander would still be his receivers coach. So yes. Tommy Guns, who are some of the 2024 D-line recruits that resources get shifted to now that 23 is 80% complete? Well, we just talked about one Tommy. That's Justin Scott. I know Elijah Rushing and Nigel Smith are two others. Ryan, who are some other guys that you think we should start to see the staff kind of move on to now that they are focusing more and more and more on the 2024 class?
Yeah, I mean, those were a couple of the guys that I was going to start out with. I mean, honestly,
I got to steal all the good ones.
I know you have to.
You know?
I mean, I would just like to kind of put some context, though, real quick. Elijah Rushing is, I think, similar to what Keon was probably as a sophomore. Just kind of looking back, he's a really talented player. He's got a massive. He's got the frame where I think he could easily be 250 plus pounds. Like he's got that 6'5", 225. Nigel Smith's probably my favorite defensive lineman that I've watched in 2024 so far. I mean, the kid is 6'5", 270 as a sophomore and kind of works inside out a ton and really talented football player. I mean, a couple guys that I think are interesting players. I don't know how far along it is as far as the relationship with Notre Dame, but Edric Houston, out of Georgia, who's 6'4", 235 pounds. We have him listed. He also has a similar frame to an Elijah Rushing, listed in shorter, obviously, but he's got a long athletic frame, really nice arm length, explosive player. And then I don't know how to pronounce Zina Umuzulu, I believe is how you pronounce it, out of Texas.
Yeah. But your guess is as good as mine.
Well, Brian, if you haven't seen his film, though, I watched his film a few weeks ago, and he is explosive, sir. He's a really dynamic athlete. Again, I don't know how likely he is that Notre Dame's going to be a serious player, but he is a really, really, really explosive defensive end. Really explosive.
He is. And the SEC's not going to – they're going to try hard not to let him get out of that area. There's no doubt about that. There's a couple other kids, like Aiden Breland is a kid that they offered. He's a big 6'5", 320 kid.
Modern day, right?
But I mean, I don't know how much time I would waste on him with those other guys on the board. Owen Waffle's a kid that Notre Dame likes. I don't know if I would take him right now.
I wouldn't.
And I know that Notre Dame likes him, but I don't know if I'd take him right now. He's a 6'3", 250-pound big end that can maybe go into 3 technique. Like, you've already got a million of those, and he doesn't fit the profile of some of those. Great motor and an athletic kid, but I just don't know if he fits my profile at this point in time of guys that I would really go to. An interesting player that Notre Dame offered recently, Ryan, and I don't know if you've had a chance to watch him yet, but he's really raw but talented, is Marquise Lightfoot. As far as like a Viper prospect, he's from Illinois. They offered him, I think, during the Blue Gold Week, 6'4", 205, all legs and arms at this point in time. But he's a pretty athletic kid. He's pretty new to the board. He's one of the few pure Vipers, I think, in the class. I'm curious. Like right now, I don't know if I would necessarily take him just yet. But he's definitely a guy that's on my board because he's pretty athletic and he's got a really nice frame, but he's like maybe 205 pounds right now, right? Like, and that's where you got to be careful with sophomores is, you got to make sure that guys aren't already full grown by the time they're sophomores, they're not going to get bigger. Right. And then you got to, some guys you think are going to grow, but let me just see a couple more months of growth from this kid, putting on some weight. But he's an athletic kid that I would keep my eye on as well in next year's class. But I'm looking at the board. There's 20 kids that have been offered already. So they're not resting on their laurels. They offered a Brian Robinson kid. He's a solid player, big kid. I don't know if he's a kid that I would push for now that they have Brandon Davis Swain in the class. And that's the other thing too, is some of these guys are off the board for me. Jay Sean Ross is an interesting kid. So it's going to be interesting how they do all this.
Yeah.
Ryan, here's an interesting one. Steve Savigiola. I hope I pronounced that right, Steve. If Notre Dame could recruit any of their former quarterbacks since 1988 for this team, who would they be all in for?
Wow.
There's 2 for me, and I've talked about this before. It's Jarius Jackson and Brady Quinn. That'd be the 2 for me. And I'd probably go Jarius because I think that this particular team needs a quarterback that can run.
Interesting.
And I think Jarius would have fit, like Jarius being coached in the modern game because again, and if he was being recruited now, he would have come up in a completely different he'd be in 7-on-7s. He'd be a far more developed passer than he was coming out of high school at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So he'd probably be him or Brady. I think probably be two for me because, again, Jimmy Clausen's the best passer Notre Dame's had in my lifetime. But I need a quarterback that's a leader that teammates respect. Same reason I wouldn't have Deshaun Kaiser as my quarterback, right?
Right.
But, if everybody had the same attitude, I'd start talking about Everett and Jimmy and Deshaun Kaiser as potential guys. Another guy that I would strongly consider and is if I knew he was going to be healthy, the pre-2015 injury version of Malik Zaire is a guy that I think we should have a conversation about. And then, of course, another guy would be that they recruited since then is I would love to have seen what Phil Jurkovec could have done in this offense. That's another one. I just got to get that shot in. But you know what? Of all of that, who I'm excited to watch? Well, I'm excited to watch Tyler Buckner.
For sure.
I mean, we forget this is a top 100 kid. I mean, this is a kid who, did some pretty good things as a freshman. So I'm excited to see what he can do. But who would your answer be for that, Ryan?
My answer would have been Brady Quinn. I thought about Phil just off of the curiosity. I would have just liked to see it, because we didn't get a chance to see it. The other one but I have to be honest, I thought your answer was going to be Jimmy Clausen just because of the scheme fit in Coach Reese's passing.
I got to have a guy that you can't have a quarterback that can't lead. That was always the knock on Jimmy. He just wasn't respected by his teammates. He wasn't a leader. And I would he like at least with Brady, you could run read zone and Brady can pull that thing and just run for a first down on 3rd and 5. Jimmy's not. Even before the foot injury, Jimmy's not doing that. So, and again, just the leadership thing, that is so important. That's so important for a quarterback. And he wasn't as bad as Deshaun, but he was not good. It wasn't good there. And that would be the reason why. But if all things were being equal in that regard, then Jimmy's the answer to me. Like if Jimmy and Brady Quinn had the same work ethic and same attitude and leadership ability, it's Jimmy Clausen. But they don't. I mean, Brady Quinn was not a great player because he had the greatest arm ever. He's the greatest. I mean, he had the great frame, but he wasn't. It wasn't because super. He just had the. Brady Quinn is that kind of guy that if he said, "Hey guys, I need everyone to do this," and it's good. You're okay. Brady said we're going to do it, so we're doing it, right? Whereas like, hold on, man. Last time you said this, Jimmy, this is what happened. Like you said, if we go here, it's going to work out, but we all got lost, and you know what I mean. Like Brady's just that guy that you talk about like the general. Right, the greatest generals are guys that just the troops say, "Hey, if you say to do it, we're doing it," and that's what makes Brady different, And so, yeah, is Brady in the same category as Jimmy Clausen as a passer? No. Is Brady Quinn a better player and a better leader and a better winner? Heck yes, heck yes. And so, I just go with Jerry. It's just because I feel as I look up at the makeup of this team, I'm really attracted to the idea of having a quarterback that brings the running element to it. That's the only reason Jarius is in this conversation for me, is because of that. If I had greater faith in the receivers, I don't know if I would still say my stance would change and I'd be 100% on Brady. That would be my thing. So, yeah. Ryan, you can answer this quickly. Sid Irish Brian, is Notre Dame recruiting Micah Tease as a receiver or a DB?
Yes. The answer is yes. Athletes. They will give him an opportunity to play wide receiver if that's what lands him to Notre Dame. But yes.
And a legitimate shot. This isn't like lie to him and in a week in the fall camp you're moving him. They'll give him a legitimate chance. I just still think defense is where he needs to go.
Agree.
Alejandro Coronel. If by chance Caleb Downs came to Notre Dame paired with Adal and Peyton Bowen, what secondary across college football in the last 20 years do you think they compare to? Oh, wow. That's a good one.
That's a loaded question.
I mean, you're talking about, looking at safety tandems, right? Like I'm trying to think of who had some great safety tandems in recent seasons. I feel like LSU had one somewhat recently, didn't they? Didn't they have a really good safety situation here somewhat recently? Boy, that's a good one. That's a really good Alejandro. I don't. Alabama had a really good safety tandem like early on. I'm trying to remember who it was. Ohio State had a really good safety. You know what? Ohio State 2015, 14, 15, and 16 might be one that I'd have to look at, Ryan, now that I think about it. Because they had who was the kid that got drafted? He's still in the league now.
Hooker.
No, I cannot believe
Oh,
I'm having
Von
these.
Bell.
Yes,
Von
yes.
Bell. Yeah.
I'm having some issues with my memory this week, man. What the heck's going on, right? I took a nap today. Like something's going on, dude. That
Yeah.
is not a good situation. But that 2015 team, you had Von Bell was a second round pick. You had the other safety ended up he was picked Tyvis Powell, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then they had a couple other safeties that were like rotation guys, backups on that team. You had Malik Hooker was a rotation guy on that team. Marshawn Latimer did not start on that team in
Crazy.
2015, which is
Crazy.
insane. You had Jaron Conley and Eli Apple were the corners. You had Von Bell at safety. You had Tyvis Powell at safety, and you had Marshawn Latimer and Malik Hooker were rotation guys on that in that secondary,
It's
which is
decent.
insane. So, I mean, most recent history, that's probably the one that I think I probably had that would be pop out to me, Ryan. Anybody else kind of pop out in your head on that one?
Yeah, no, I was trying to look back to like Patrick Peterson days in LSU when they had the Honey Badger and all that type of stuff, but that was literally the only one that popped in. Maybe a Landon Collins when it was with Alabama type of conversation,
Right.
but
And
yeah,
that's
no, I
just
mean,
the safeties because, I mean, Notre Dame
right,
still needs corners.
exactly, yeah, exactly. It's
It's pretty
that's a
good.
tough one to beat, man. That Ohio State team was just loaded. It was
Yeah.
crazy. Remember when they played defense in Ohio State? It was
Yeah, I know,
a long
right? What the
time
heck
ago.
happened there? That's
Right,
weird.
right.
Weird. And then that random year where, Jeff Halfley shows up and they're pretty good again.
Yeah,
Very, 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 very strange. All right, we gotta get out of here pretty soon. Big Jim, has Darian Gillette ever visited? No, he has not.
no.
John Platt asks, "Is 300 points?" I assume he's referring to the 247 Sports Composite list. Does 300 points give Notre Dame the number one recruiting call this year? No, it does not. I think that right now, with the dream class that we talked about, gets them to about 315. If my memory serves me correctly, that would be ranked number one in like about half of the last 10-year classes, or around half. There are some years guys got in the 320s, and some years they were low. Like one year was like 304. I think it's probably the lowest I remember seeing a number one class on the composite the last 10 years. So it gets them top five for sure. Like 300 gets them top five for sure. But it would only get them, it wouldn't get them number one. They'd have to get to around that 315 mark to really have a shot at that number one spot. Irish for Life. Hey, you had a couple really good questions about early predictions for next year. So just so you know, I didn't want you to think we were dismissing your question. We're actually going to have a couple shows on that coming up. We're going to like kind of this week a little bit, but then next week we're going to launch into our sort of our build up to the season. And we're going to look at like early season. Like we're going to take like a first glance at the schedule and just kind of, go over the schedule and who we think, because your second part about, is about, New Year's 6 and all that. So when we launch it, it's probably going to be next week is when we're going to really launch it. We're going to dive into just these questions. So I don't want to give them now because we're going to have a show on this soon, but I didn't want you to think that we were ignoring your questions. So it's very good questions, and such a good questions that we already have planned shows about those very topics. Josh Buffo, the motivational business banker, says if Harry Houston gets everyone he's after, how can that not be recruiter of the year? Because so would Al Washington, and so would Chris O'Leary in the scenario that we gave earlier. So that's the interesting thing is, I mean, Al Washington got every guy he wanted to, and Chancey Stuckey came pretty darn close, and to get all those, and he didn't get everyone because they wanted Samson Okunlola, right? So I mean, it's similar to Chancey Stuckey; they didn't get Carnell Tate, right? And Tyler Williams, but it's close. But I mean, Josh, the nice thing about it though is if they get that class that we talked about, not even including Caleb Downs, it would be a legitimate discussion on who is the recruiter of the year. And that's kind of where you want to be, right? Like you want to be in a situation where, four coaches are in that. You're like, okay, I'm making my case for Harry Houston. And Ryan's like, hold on a second now. Like, let's talk about Al Washington. And Sean's like, where's the love for Chancey Stuckey? And then Vince pimes in with like, y'all, Dante Moore, you know what I mean? Like, that's where you want to be, you know what I mean? And then Ryan checks his phone. Oh, wow, Caleb Downs is committed. So let's talk about Chris O'Leary, right? Like, that's where you want to be. And then we're like, hey, why is no one talking about the linebacking core when they got top 50 players? And that's ultimately where we want to be, because when it's obvious, you don't have a great class. You have a great line class. You want there to be some conversation, and I think that's a good thing. Let's see here. Tommy Guns, real quick. Ryan, if you could see if there's any more at the bottom that
Sure.
that pop out. But Tommy Gunn says, B. Ryan, can y'all ever see Freeman doing with Chad what Lou did with Vinny? One of the 10 coaches, but literally just recruits. There's no need to do that because the rules are in place now that a person like Chad Bowden can have the role that he can have. The only thing he can't do is go on the road. But if there's a situation where one of the coaches can't go on the road, because the rule is you can only have 10 guys on the – like, was it like nine or 10 guys? You can only have a certain number of guys on the road at a time. So if an assistant coach has an obligation, he's going to be gone, he's not going to be on the road recruiting, then a GA or somebody like Chad can go on the road. So honestly, you don't need to do that. You don't need to not waste, because I don't mean like that, but you don't need to take away a position coach to give to him when he can basically do everything that they can do now anyway. And in some instances, there's in a couple little narrow instances, there's less restrictions on him than there's the others. And, he's not an assistant coach where he has to talk about, playing for him, right? He never has to be the bad guy that benches a kid or makes a kid run or does whatever, because he's just the recruiting guy. So I think that adds to it. Dexter Domer, I'm late in catching up at 2 times the speed. That's got to be really interesting listening to me at 2 times the speed. I will see if you cover this early, but should we make anything out of the new offers? Are these kids takes or safety valves they want to get in on early? Ryan, I don't know if not all of them are takes, obviously, but what it is, is it's just, look, they're on the road. They're coming across kids they like. They're realizing that, hey, we're not in a situation where we are now. We've got to find some other good players. And that's what it's doing. This is called good recruiting. And Dexter, this is a great question, because in the past, they would expand the board when it was panic time, Ryan. This isn't panic time. This is, we're not going to get caught in a panic mode. So until we get guys that, until we get Micah Bell or Micah Tees or Christian Gray to recruit, we're going to keep recruiting guys until we get, these other offensive linemen to commit. I'm going to keep going because we can't just get 3. Right. Mm-hmm. So we're going to keep recruiting guys. Hey, Monroe and Charles, if you guys want to keep doing that, that's cool. I understand it, but we got to make sure we're taken care of too. The only position where I don't support that is quarterback for reasons I've stated in the past. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you still have a need, like I wouldn't be opposed to them, expanding the linebacker board. And part of me wonders, part of me starts kind of, this is my conspiratorialness, Ryan. I started saying, maybe they're in a better shot with Jay Nosberry than I think, because they haven't expanded the board of linebacker. They need another linebacker.
Yeah.
Why not? So is it Mpemba? Is it Osbury? Do you want to see how things go with Darian Gillette when he gets on campus? So part of me wonders that, Ryan, is why haven't they expanded the board at linebacker like they have at other? I mean, look, they're in a good position at receiver, and they're still out there offering. They've offered 2 new receivers in the last 2 weeks.
I know.
And they're good offers. These kids can play.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of them are top 150 kids. It's
not like Mazel's a top ranked recruit. Yes, 100%.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, we just talked about the corner, obviously, that they just offered today. I mean, he is a top 150 player too in Josiah Wagner. So yeah, they're identifying good football players and they're offering them, Dexter. Whether everyone is a take. I mean, obviously, like Brian said, not everybody's a take, but you have to give them credit that they're still identifying. They're identifying good football players. It's not just like they're throwing out offers to 3 stars because they're scrambling here, right? Like they're offering top 150, top 200 type of players right now. It's substantial stuff right now. So
you, other than saying it's interesting, you had no further comment on my linebacker conspiracy theory, Ryan. I'm going to call you out. I'm going to call you, not call you out, but I'm going to challenge you to respond to that. Like, why do you think they haven't offered him a linebacker? Again, this is opinion time. We don't know the answers, right? This is part of the show where we're just giving you our opinion. But in your opinion, why haven't they done that?
Well, I mean, when I talked to Jay Nosberry after his visit, I put into my mailbag this week that at this point, I'm not really that if Jaden Osbury ends up in a place not Notre Dame, I don't think it's going to be LSU either. You know what I mean? That's kind of just always been assumed, like LSU has to be the leader because he's from Baton Rouge. He's right there. So yeah, I think that is telling sometimes most of the time, when boards don't expand. You have to feel pretty good about where you are with someone. Like you said, there has to be one more. So either they feel really good about their prospects with Darian Gillette down the road when they get him on campus, or they feel that they're in a great spot with an Osbury or Samuel Mpemba, one of the two. So yeah, I think that you might be onto something there.
I know what I hope the answer is.
Yes.
I hope the answer, so we'll have to see about that. We'll have to see about that. So really great questions tonight. I think Tim Hatch has a great way to end this one. I think that's the best way to end it. Go Irish. So as you all know, let me pull this up so we can remind y'all. Okay, so we'll make it easy for you. Hit that like button. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the notification bell. So on a day where I'm supposed to have jury duty and we moved the show back, I ended up not having jury duty. Got pushed back a week or two. They said it would be sometime 16th or later. So we'll see when that actually is. So I didn't actually have to serve jury duty today, but it was a little too late. And Ryan and I talked, so let's do a night show. So on those days, you'll still know when we're going to show, even though it's not our normal time, because you hit the notification bell when we schedule the show, which tonight I did a little before 6 o'clock. And hey, pop up. Hey, Irish Breakdown's doing a night show. Gotta love it. And so, of course, that's why you need to hit that notification bell and share this podcast. Sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. And, of course, check out all of our content at Irish Breakdown. We'll be back tomorrow at 12:30. Ryan, we're going to discuss, Vince and I are going to discuss, and I'd love it if you want to join the show. We haven't talked about this. You're more than welcome to do so. We're going to talk about this transfer portal stuff, right? We're going to talk about my proposal to fix the transfer portal. We're also going to talk about the NCAA's move to, sort of provide guidance finally for NIL stuff. Whether it's a legitimate attempt for them to rein things in, or is this just a for show statement to make it look like they've done something when in reality they're not actually going to do anything? Because you can offer, at the end of the day, Ryan, you can offer all the statements and guidelines you want. If you don't enforce it, nothing matters. You can make it a speed limit of 65, but if you never enforce it, then people can drive however freaking fast they want to drive, right? If there's no threat of being pulled over and punished in any way, shape, form, or fashion, then that's what's going to happen. And that's true in everything. So if it doesn't have some teeth, then nothing's going to happen. And if they don't enforce the rules, nothing's going to happen. So we're going to talk about all that tomorrow. We're going to talk about the transfer portal tomorrow. We'll talk about all that kind of stuff. And, of course, we'll do our daily mailbag. So if you didn't get a question asked today, bring it tomorrow, and we'll be ready to answer it. So everybody, thank you all so much for being with us for this show. It really had a lot of fun. Ryan, thank you for joining me tonight and being willing to be flexible with me. Have a great time. We can always continue these conversations on the message board. Sign up, boards.irishbreakdown.com. Until next time, thank you all so much for joining us and being a part of the Irish Breakdown podcast.